family should be thanking me! I sent those 4 sinners straight to judgment!
You will be silent. This court has heard enough. Based on the evidence and your profound, disgusting lack of remorse, this court hereby sentences you to the maximum term.
On the night of October 14, 2023, the Isaacs family was brutally murdered in their suburban home in Phoenix, Arizona, in what would later be revealed as a desperate act to conceal years of financial fraud. Robert Isaacs, 42, his wife Brandy, 40, and their children Sophia, 16, and Thomas, 13, were found dead in their beds, each having suffered multiple stab wounds in what initially appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong. The victims were discovered when Robert failed to show up for an important meeting at his accounting firm, prompting a colleague to request a welfare check at the family's home in the Arcadia neighborhood, a typically peaceful community known for its citrus trees and views of Camelback Mountain. What investigators didn't know yet was that these deaths were intricately connected to millions of dollars in missing church funds and a respected community figure who had been living a double life. If you're watching this video, please hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. The murders occurred on a Saturday night when the desert heat had finally begun to relent, giving way to the more moderate temperatures that Phoenix residents eagerly anticipate each fall. Father Michael Donovan arrived at the Isaacs home shortly after 10 p.m., dressed not in his clerical collar but in dark clothing and latex gloves, carrying a bag containing zip ties, duct tape, and a hunting knife purchased specifically for this purpose from a sporting goods store 50 miles outside the city limits. Security footage would later show his black sedan driving through the neighborhood at 9:47 p.m., though the vehicle's license plate was deliberately obscured with mud. The priest had meticulously planned this visit, knowing the family's routines from years of close interaction with them as parishioners, choosing a time when neighbors were likely to be either out or already asleep, and parking his car 3 blocks away to avoid immediate association with the scene. The Isaacs had welcomed Father Donovan into their home many times before, for dinner, for prayer, to discuss church matters, and on this night they likely did the same, unaware of the danger that had crossed their threshold. Robert Isaacs had recently completed a voluntary financial audit of St. Catherine's Catholic Church, where Father Donovan had served as parish priest for the past decade, discovering over $2.3 million in funds had been systematically diverted over 8 years. Though Robert had not yet publicly disclosed his findings, he had scheduled a meeting with the Diocese Financial Oversight Board for October 16th, just 2 days away, and had confided in his wife and teenage daughter about the disturbing discovery. Investigators would later find Robert's detailed spreadsheets and documentation on his laptop, along with emails to the diocese requesting the urgent meeting, providing a clear motive for the timing of the attack. What happened inside the home was reconstructed through forensic evidence, revealing a methodical killer who sought to eliminate not just Robert, but every member of the family who might have knowledge of the financial malfeasance. The violence began in the master bedroom, where Robert and Brandy were attacked first, with evidence suggesting Robert was subdued quickly while still half asleep. But Brandy had time to fight back, scratching her attacker and leaving crucial DNA evidence under her fingernails. Sophia and Thomas were killed next, neither showing signs of significant struggle, suggesting they may have been asleep when attacked or were too disoriented to effectively resist. All 4 victims suffered multiple stab wounds, primarily to the chest and neck, with precision that suggested knowledge of human anatomy or research into efficient killing methods. The crime scene initially confused detectives from the Phoenix Police Department's homicide unit due to its contradictory elements. While the scene had some characteristics of a home invasion, a forced entry through a back window, drawers left open in the master bedroom, and the wife's jewelry box emptied onto the bed, Other aspects seemed inconsistent with typical burglary homicides. Nothing of significant value was actually taken from the home, including electronics, cash, and several pieces of expensive jewelry that had been overlooked. The home's alarm system had been deactivated using the correct code, not bypassed, as would be expected in a break-in, suggesting the killer either knew the family well enough to have their code or had somehow coerced a family member to provide it. The staged break-in showed an amateur's understanding of what such a crime should look like, rather than the patterns typically seen in actual burglaries. The neighborhood where the Isaacs lived was one of those Phoenix enclaves where privacy walls and desert landscaping created both physical and psychological barriers between homes, perhaps explaining why no one reported hearing the violence that occurred that night. The family's Spanish-style home, with its thick adobe walls and double-pane windows installed to keep out the desert heat, had inadvertently created an acoustically isolated environment where screams could go unheard. Their nearest neighbor, Eleanor Whitman, would later tell detectives she thought she heard a car door slam around 11:30 p.m., but saw nothing when she looked out her window, attributing the sound to someone returning late from dinner. The perfect Phoenix night, clear, mild, with a slight breeze carrying the scent of citrus, had masked the sounds of a family's final moments. Father Donovan left the Isaacs' home shortly after midnight, having spent over 2 hours inside, ensuring his crime was complete and attempting to stage the scene. Traffic cameras captured his sedan driving through an intersection 5 miles from the crime scene at 12:23 a.m., with the driver's face partially visible and matching the priest's profile. He returned to the rectory of St. Catherine's Church, where he lived alone, entering through a side door not covered by the church's security cameras. The next morning, October 15th, Father Donovan conducted Sunday Mass as scheduled, delivering a sermon on forgiveness and community support during difficult times. Several parishioners would later recall that the priest seemed unusually subdued during the service, attributing it at the time to fatigue rather than the weight of his actions from the night before. The bodies were discovered Monday morning, October 16th, when Robert failed to appear for both his work commitments and the scheduled meeting with the Diocese Financial Board. Jason Mercer, Robert's colleague at the accounting firm where he worked, called the Isaacs home and, receiving no answer, contacted Brandy's school, learning she had not arrived for her teaching position that morning. Increasingly concerned, Mercer drove to the Isaacs' home during his lunch break, finding newspapers piled by the front door and both family cars in the garage. After repeated knocking went unanswered, Mercer called 911, reporting that something felt seriously wrong, given the family's reliability and Robert's important scheduled meeting that day. Officers Miguel Rodriguez and Sarah Patel responded to the welfare check call at 1:17 p.m., approaching the situation as routine until they noticed what appeared to be blood smeared on the inside of a window visible from the back patio. Following department protocol, they requested backup before making entry through the unlocked back door, where they discovered what would later be described in their report as a scene of extraordinary violence that appeared to have been executed with both precision and rage. The officers secured the scene, confirmed all 4 family members were deceased, and immediately called for homicide detectives and crime scene technicians to begin what would become one of the most high-profile murder investigations in recent Phoenix history. Detective Logan Brooks arrived at the scene at 2:05 p.m., bringing 15 years of homicide investigation experience to bear on a case that would test both his professional skills and personal resilience. The temperature outside had climbed to 92 degrees, typical for mid-October in Phoenix, and the house's air conditioning had been running continuously since the murders, preserving the scene from the worst effects of decomposition despite the nearly 38 hours that had elapsed. Brooks's first observation, noted in his case log, was that the scene reads like someone's idea of what a home invasion should look like, rather than what they typically do, immediately raising his suspicions about the true nature of the crime. Robert Isaacs was more than just the 42-year-old victim of a horrific crime. He was the foundation of his family, a respected CPA whose analytical mind and integrity had earned him the trust of clients and colleagues throughout Phoenix. Friends described him as methodical and principled, with a keen eye for detail that served him well both in his professional life at the accounting firm of Mercer, Landis and Associates, and in his volunteer work as financial committee chair at St. Catherine's Catholic Church. Robert's colleagues spoke of his ability to spot irregularities in even the most complex financial statements, a skill that ultimately led him to uncover the massive embezzlement scheme that would cost him and his family their lives. His office at home contained neatly organized files, a desk calendar with family events marked in green and work commitments in blue, and photographs of hiking trips to the Grand Canyon with his children, evidence of a man who valued both order and adventure. Brandy Isaacs, 40, brought warmth and compassion to her role as a fourth-grade teacher at Desert Willow Elementary School, where she had taught for 12 years and was beloved by students, parents, and fellow educators alike. As the church volunteer coordinator at St. Catherine's, she organized everything from food drives to community outreach programs, maintaining detailed spreadsheets of volunteers and hours that reflected her organizational skills and dedication to service. Colleagues at her school described her classroom as a haven of creativity and kindness, with walls covered in student artwork and bookshelves filled with diverse literature she had personally collected to engage young minds. The last entry in her journal, found on her nightstand, expressed her shock and disappointment about Father Donovan's betrayal, writing, "How will we explain this to the congregation? So many people trusted him with not just their donations but their spiritual lives." Sophia Isaacs, at 16, was a junior at Phoenix Central High School, where she maintained a 4.0 GPA while serving as editor of the school newspaper and competing on the debate team. As an altar server at St. Catherine's since the age of 12, she had recently taken on additional responsibilities helping organize donation records, a role that likely exposed her to some of the financial irregularities her father had been investigating. Her bedroom told the story of a thoughtful young woman balancing typical teenage interests with deeper intellectual pursuits. Posters of pop musicians shared wall space with framed quotes from female philosophers, and her bookshelf contained both young adult fiction and weighty tomes on world religions and ethics. Friends would later tell detectives that in the weeks before her death, Sophia had seemed troubled, confiding in her closest friend Megan that something serious is happening at church, but Dad says we need to be absolutely sure before we say anything. Thomas Isaacs, the youngest victim at 13, was in many ways still a child despite his transition to adolescence, a sports enthusiast who played baseball for his middle school team and collected trading cards that were meticulously organized in protective sleeves in his room. As an altar boy at St. Catherine's, Thomas had worked closely with Father Donovan during Sunday services, looking up to the priest as a spiritual mentor and father figure beyond his own home. His science teacher described him as curious about everything, noting that he had recently won an honorable mention in the school science fair for a project on desert water conservation. The night before his death, Thomas had texted a friend about an upcoming baseball game, making plans to practice pitching over the weekend, future moments stolen by the very man who had baptized him as an infant. The Isaacs home in the Arcadia neighborhood of Phoenix reflected their 15 years of building a life together. Family photographs lining the hallway showed Robert and Brandy's wedding at St. Catherine's, the birth of each child, family vacations to the California coast, and school achievements framed with parental pride. Their kitchen calendar for October 2023 showed the rhythm of a busy family. Sophia's debate tournaments, Thomas's baseball games, Brandy's teacher conferences, and Robert's scheduled meeting with the diocese financial board boldly circled on October 16th, a meeting he would never attend. Neighbors described the family as private but friendly, the kind who would collect mail for you during vacation and whose children were unfailingly polite, a reputation that made the violence inflicted upon them seem all the more incomprehensible to the community. What made the Isaacs particularly valuable to their community was their consistent, reliable presence, the type of family that forms the backbone of schools, churches, and neighborhoods without seeking recognition or praise. Robert's accounting firm had given him their prestigious Integrity Award the previous year for his work helping local nonprofits navigate tax regulations at reduced rates. Brandy had been named Teacher of the Year at Desert Willow Elementary in 2021, with the principal citing her exceptional ability to reach struggling students and involve parents in their children's education. Sophia had recently been selected for a competitive summer journalism program at Arizona State University, while Thomas had been chosen to represent his school at a regional mathematics competition scheduled for November. The family's connection to St. Catherine's Catholic Church ran deep, with roots stretching back to Robert and Brandy's wedding there in 2006, followed by the baptisms of both children and years of active participation in church life. Robert had joined the financial committee 5 years earlier, bringing his professional expertise to the volunteer position with characteristic thoroughness. Brandy coordinated the church's extensive volunteer programs, managing over 100 regular volunteers who staffed everything from the food pantry to the religious education classes. Sophia had progressed from student to helper in those same religious education classes, while Thomas had recently expressed interest in potentially pursuing the priesthood himself, inspired by his interactions with Father Donovan, a tragic irony that would later haunt those who knew the family. Over the 3 weeks prior to the murders, Robert had been conducting a thorough audit of the church's finances, a routine procedure he performed annually, but which had taken on greater significance when he began noticing discrepancies. According to files recovered from his laptop, he had initially attributed the irregularities to clerical errors or outdated accounting practices. But by October 10th, just 4 days before the murders, Robert had compiled enough evidence to determine that approximately $2.3 million had been systematically diverted from church accounts over an 8-year period, coinciding almost exactly with Father Donovan's tenure at St. Catherine's. The scope of Father Donovan's betrayal extended far beyond financial theft, affecting the more than 200 families who had entrusted their spiritual lives to his guidance. Parents who had brought their infants to him for baptism, teenagers who had confided their deepest struggles during confession, elderly parishioners who had found comfort in his hospital visits, all would be forced to re-evaluate these sacred interactions in light of his crimes. Many of these community members would later attend the Isaacs funeral, forming a procession that stretched for over a mile as they accompanied the 4 caskets to the cemetery, a visible testament to the void this family's loss had created in the fabric of Phoenix society. The investigation would reveal that Robert had shared his concerns about the financial discrepancies with Brandy and Sophia, though he had apparently tried to shield Thomas from the troubling discovery. Brandy's sister, Caroline Mitchell, told detectives that Brandy had called her on October 12th, 2 days before the murders, sounding distressed about something Robert found at church, but providing few details, saying only that it's worse than anyone could imagine, and that Robert was gathering final documentation before the meeting with diocese officials. This conversation would later be cited as evidence that multiple family members had knowledge of the embezzlement, explaining why Father Donovan felt compelled to silence the entire household rather than just Robert. The tragedy of the Isaacs family is compounded by how close they came to exposing the truth before falling victim to it. Had Robert's meeting with the diocese financial board occurred as scheduled on October 16th, Father Donovan's schemes would have been revealed. Funds might have been recovered, and legal proceedings would have replaced violence as the consequence of his actions. Instead, the family's diligence and commitment to truth became the catalyst for their deaths, transforming them from living members of their community to symbols of betrayal's devastating cost. The 911 call came in at 1:14 p.m. on Monday, October 16, 2023, when Jason Mercer's concerned voice reported his inability to contact the Isaacs family. "I'm at their house now, and something's definitely wrong," Mercer told the dispatcher, his professional composure beginning to crack as he described the accumulation of newspapers, both cars in the garage, and complete silence from within the home. The dispatch operator classified the call as a priority welfare check rather than an emergency, but added a note that the caller was a reliable source with valid concerns about a family of 4 not responding, elevating its position in the response queue. Within minutes, officers Rodriguez and Patel were diverted from their patrol route in an adjacent neighborhood, arriving at the scene at 1:17 p.m. to find Mercer pacing anxiously on the front lawn of the well-maintained Spanish-style home that sat behind a neatly trimmed oleander hedge. Officer Rodriguez's body camera captured the initial approach to the house, recording Mercer's explanation that Robert Isaacs was absolutely reliable and had missed an extremely important meeting with church officials that morning. Robert's been auditing the church finances for weeks, and today was when he was supposed to present his findings to the diocese, Mercer explained, his accounting background evident in his precise description of the situation. The 2 officers performed a perimeter check of the property, following standard protocol for welfare concerns, with Officer Patel's body camera recording the critical moment when she peered through a back window and noticed what appeared to be a reddish-brown smear on the inside of the glass. "Miguel, I've got what looks like blood here." Her voice came through clearly on the recording, immediately changing the tenor of the call from routine to potentially life-threatening. The officers called for backup before making entry through an unlocked back door, drawing their service weapons as they announced Phoenix Police and moved systematically through the lower level of the home. The body camera footage, later reviewed frame by homicide detectives, showed the officers discovering signs of disturbance. A toppled lamp in the living room, kitchen drawers left partially open, and, most significantly, drops of what would later be confirmed as blood on the tile floor leading toward the staircase. Officer Rodriguez radioed dispatch at 1:26 p.m., his voice tight with controlled tension. "We're going to need detectives and CSI at this location. We have signs of violence and no contact with residents yet." The dispatcher acknowledged upgrading the call to a potential crime scene and dispatching additional units while the 2 officers continued their careful ascent of the staircase, following their training to clear the entire residence before focusing on any single area. The discovery of the bodies, captured on the officers' body cameras but later restricted from public release out of respect for the victims, showed the professionalism of Rodriguez and Patel even in the face of extreme violence. The master bedroom contained the bodies of Robert and Brandy Isaacs, both with multiple stab wounds and significant blood loss that had soaked through the bedding and onto the carpet below. Sophia and Thomas were found in their respective bedrooms, similarly attacked, with evidence suggesting Sophia may have woken during the assault based on defensive wounds on her hands and arms. Officer Patel checked for pulses on all 4 victims, confirming at 1:32 p.m. what was already visually apparent. "Dispatch, we have 4 deceased individuals, apparent homicide. Scene is secure, but we'll maintain position until detectives arrive." The officers then withdrew to the home's entryway, preserving the scene from contamination while securing the perimeter with additional officers who began arriving minutes later. Detective Logan Brooks arrived at 2:05 p.m., accompanied by his partner, Detective Maya Fernandez, both from the Phoenix Police Department's Homicide Unit. Brooks, known for his methodical approach and attention to detail, began by interviewing Mercer outside the crime scene, establishing a timeline of when the family was last known to be alive. Robert texted me yesterday morning around 9 a.m., confirming he had all the documentation ready for today's meeting, Mercer stated in his recorded interview, providing investigators with their first crucial time frame. He was going to present evidence of what he called significant financial discrepancies at the church, but he wouldn't give me specifics over the phone. This information immediately gave detectives a potential motive to investigate, though Brooks was careful not to jump to conclusions, instructing the officers securing the scene to treat the case as a possible home invasion until evidence proved otherwise. Crime scene investigators arrived at 2:20 p.m., led by senior CSI technician Dr. Aisha Johnson, who would later testify that the Isaacs crime scene was one of the most meticulously documented in her 15-year career. The CSI team spent the next 14 hours processing the scene, photographing and collecting over 200 pieces of evidence, including blood samples from various locations, fingerprints, fibers, and most critically, scrapings from beneath Brandy Isaacs' fingernails that appeared to contain skin cells not her own. Dr. Johnson noted in her preliminary report that while the scene had characteristics of a home invasion, certain inconsistencies suggest this may be a stage scene intended to misdirect investigators. These inconsistencies included the selective nature of the disturbance, with some valuable items left untouched while others of lesser value were scattered, and the fact that the home's security system had been deactivated using the correct code rather than being disabled or triggered. The medical examiner, Dr. Thomas Chen, arrived at 3:45 p.m. to make his initial assessment before the bodies would be transported to the morgue for autopsy. Dr. Chen's preliminary examination at the scene established an estimated time of death between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. on the night of October 14, 15, based on body temperature, lividity, and rigor mortis. All four victims appear to have died from multiple stab wounds to the torso and neck, Dr. Chen noted in his on-scene report, adding that the precision of certain wounds, particularly those to the carotid artery, suggests either training or research into efficient killing methods. This observation would later become significant as investigators learned about Father Donovan's background, which included a brief period studying medicine before entering the seminary. As the CSI team meticulously processed the scene, Detectives Brooks and Fernandez expanded their investigation outward, interviewing neighbors and establishing a canvass of the surrounding blocks. Eleanor Whitman, the Isaacs' next-door neighbor, provided the first potentially significant lead when she mentioned hearing a car door close around 11:30 p.m. on Saturday night. "I thought it was odd because it sounded close, but not like it was in a driveway," Whitman told Detective Fernandez, who made note of this timing as consistent with the medical examiner's preliminary time of death estimate. Another neighbor, James Cortez, reported seeing an unfamiliar sedan parked on a side street about 3 blocks away when he walked his dog around 10:15 p.m., describing it as dark-colored, maybe navy or black, but unable to recall the make or model. While the neighborhood canvass continued, Detective Brooks obtained a warrant to access Robert Isaacs' personal and work computers, working with the department's digital forensics unit, to recover files related to the church audit Robert had been conducting. By 6:30 p.m., just hours into the investigation, they had uncovered a folder labeled St. Catherine's Financial Review 2023, containing spreadsheets, bank statements, and a draft report addressed to Bishop Anthony Morales and the Diocesan Financial Oversight Board. The report documented systematic diversion of funds from church accounts to several offshore accounts through a complex series of transfers designed to avoid detection, totaling approximately $2.3 million over 8 years. Robert's notes within the files specifically mentioned Father Michael Donovan's exclusive access to certain accounts and unusual patterns of transfers that coincided with the priest's periodic vacations. The discovery of these files shifted the investigation's focus dramatically, with Brooks immediately dispatching officers to locate and interview Father Donovan, who was found conducting an evening prayer service at St. Catherine's Church. The officers were instructed not to detain the priest, but to request he come to the station for an interview regarding the Isaacs family, without mentioning the financial investigation or treating him as a suspect at this stage. Father Donovan agreed to the interview, expressing appropriate shock and concern about the family's death, and arrived at the Phoenix Police Headquarters at 8:15 p.m., where Detectives Brooks and Fernandez were waiting to conduct what would be the first of several interviews with the man who would eventually be charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The most significant breakthrough in the early investigation came at 11:42 p.m. on October 16th, when Dr. Johnson called Detective Brooks from the crime lab with preliminary results from the fingernail scrapings taken from Brandy Isaacs. "We have foreign DNA," Dr. Johnson reported, her voice betraying unusual excitement for the typically reserved scientist. "The sample is substantial enough for rapid analysis, and we should have results within 24 hours if you can get us a comparison sample." This development led Brooks to extend his initial interview with Father Donovan, who had been maintaining a convincing presentation of pastoral concern for the family, and to request a voluntary DNA sample, which the priest provided without objection, a decision he would later regret when represented by legal counsel. By the morning of October 17th, approximately 24 hours into the investigation, detectives had gathered enough preliminary evidence to focus their investigation primarily on Father Donovan, though they maintained the appearance of a broader inquiry. Search warrants were being prepared for the priest's residence at the church rectory, his personal vehicle, and his financial records. Brooks assigned officers to discreetly monitor Donovan's movements without his knowledge while awaiting the DNA comparison results. In a private meeting with the Phoenix police chief and representatives from the district attorney's office, Brooks laid out the evolving theory of the case. "We have a victim who discovered a massive embezzlement scheme, scheduled a meeting to expose it, and was killed along with his family 2 days before that meeting could take place. The person with the most to lose from that meeting appears to have had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit these murders." The autopsy results began coming in late on October 17th, with Dr. Chen confirming his initial assessments and providing additional details that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. All 4 victims had died from multiple stab wounds, with Robert sustaining 17 wounds, Brandy 12, Sophia 9, and Thomas 7, suggesting the killer had been most frenzied in the attack on the father, likely the primary target. The wounds on Robert and Brandy showed differences in depth and precision, with Robert's appearing to have been inflicted while he was unaware or incapacitated, while Brandy's indicated she had time to struggle, consistent with the defensive wounds on her hands and the skin cells found beneath her fingernails. Dr. Chen also noted bruising patterns on the children, suggesting they had been restrained, possibly with zip ties, before being killed. Evidence of premeditation that would later support the first-degree murder charges. The final critical discovery of the initial investigation phase came at 7:23 a.m. on October 18th, when the crime lab called with the DNA comparison results. The sample from beneath Brandy Isaacs' fingernails was a match to the DNA provided voluntarily by Father Michael Donovan, with the lab director stating the probability of a false match at less than 1 in 1 billion. With this evidence in hand, combined with the financial motive established through Robert's files and the priest's opportunity to commit the crimes during his unaccounted hours that Saturday night, Detectives Brooks and Fernandez secured an arrest warrant for Father Michael Donovan on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The man who had baptized over 200 children in the Phoenix community, heard countless confessions, and presided over weddings and funerals would now face justice for the most profound betrayal imaginable, not just of his religious vows, but of the very lives of a family who had trusted him as their spiritual guide. The DNA evidence from beneath Brandy Isaacs' fingernails transformed the investigation, shifting it from a broad inquiry with multiple potential directions to a focused case building against one suspect, Father Michael Donovan. Detective Logan Brooks received the lab confirmation at his desk, the phone pressed tightly to his ear, as the lab technician detailed the match statistics. The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual with this DNA profile is approximately 1 in 1.2 billion. Brooks scribbled this figure on his notepad, circling it twice before thanking the technician and immediately calling his partner. "We've got him, Maya," he said to Detective Fernandez, his normally measured tone giving way to the urgency of the moment. "The DNA under Brandy's nails is Donovan's statistical certainty. I'm calling the DA right now for an arrest warrant." This single piece of physical evidence, a mother's last defensive act as she fought her attacker, had created the first unbreakable link between the trusted priest and the brutal murders. As the warrant was being processed, Brooks and Fernandez compiled a comprehensive timeline of Father Donovan's activities in the days surrounding the murders, identifying a critical window of approximately 4 hours on the night of October 14th, when the priest's whereabouts could not be accounted for. Church records showed Donovan had conducted an evening confession session until 8:30 p.m., after which he told the parish secretary he was retiring for the evening with a migraine. His next confirmed appearance was at 6 a.m. on Sunday morning as he prepared for early Mass, leaving a gap that perfectly encompassed the medical examiner's estimated time of death. When questioned about this period during his initial interview, Donovan had claimed to be alone in the rectory reading and praying, a claim impossible to verify but equally impossible to disprove without contradicting evidence. The financial investigation was proceeding in parallel, with forensic accountants from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division now assisting the Phoenix police with analyzing the complex money trail Robert Isaacs had begun to unravel. Special Agent Catherine Walsh, specializing in financial crimes, reviewed Robert's documentation and expanded on his findings, discovering that the embezzled $2.3 million had been transferred through a series of shell companies before ultimately being deposited in accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. What's remarkable about Isaac's work, Agent Walsh noted in her preliminary report, is that he managed to trace the funds through multiple layers of concealment with limited resources and authority, essentially doing what would typically require a team of federal investigators and international cooperation agreements. The paper trail connecting these accounts to Father Donovan included signature cards from the offshore banks, wire transfer authorizations bearing his handwriting, and travel records showing his presence in the Cayman Islands coinciding with the opening of the accounts. While the financial and DNA evidence was compelling, detectives needed to establish opportunity and means, leading them to expand their canvass of the Isaacs neighborhood. A breakthrough came when officers located a home 3 blocks from the crime scene with an external security camera that captured a partial view of the street where Eleanor Whitman had heard a car door close around 11:30 p.m. Reviewing the footage, analysts from the department's Technical Investigations Unit enhanced an image showing a dark sedan parked at 10:02 p.m. and then leaving at 12:17 a.m. Though the vehicle's license plate was not visible and the driver's face was obscured, the car's make and model, a black Audi A4, matched the vehicle registered to Father Donovan, which was now being thoroughly processed by the CSI team. The search of Donovan's vehicle yielded crucial physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. Using luminol and alternative light sources, CSI technicians discovered traces of blood in the trunk that had been meticulously cleaned but not completely removed. Preliminary testing indicated the blood was human, and samples were expedited for DNA comparison with the victims. Additionally, a receipt from a hardware store 40 miles outside Phoenix was found in the glove compartment, dated October 12th, for the purchase of latex gloves, duct tape, and a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade, items consistent with both the restraint marks on the victims and the size and shape of the stab wounds identified in the autopsy. The search of Father Donovan's residence at the church rectory revealed a man living far beyond the means of a parish priest. Behind the modest furnishings of his official quarters, investigators discovered a hidden safe containing over $25,000 in cash, a collection of luxury watches valued at more than $100,000, and documentation for a condominium in Scottsdale purchased through one of the shell companies identified in the financial investigation. Detective Fernandez, cataloging these items, remarked to Brooks, "He was building a nest egg for an exit strategy. The question is, was he planning to run before or after Isaacs exposed him?" This evidence of hidden wealth provided additional support for the financial motive, suggesting Donovan had been systematically preparing for a life funded by the embezzled church donations. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Father Donovan's computer, which the Digital Forensics Unit had been methodically examining. Technicians recovered a series of deleted internet searches from October 9 to 13, the days immediately after Robert Likely discovered the embezzlement and before the murders. These searches included how to stage a home invasion, undetectable poisons, knife wounds, fatal locations, human body, and, most incriminating, can DNA be found under fingernails after death? This digital trail painted a picture of a desperate man researching how to commit murder and avoid detection in the days leading up to the crime, directly contradicting his presentation as a shocked and grieving pastor during his initial police interview. With the arrest warrant secured, Brooks faced a tactical decision about how to apprehend Father Donovan with minimal public spectacle while ensuring officer safety. "This is going to send shock waves through the community," Brooks told Phoenix Police Chief Garcia during their strategy meeting. "We need to handle this with extreme sensitivity while still treating him as the dangerous suspect he is." The decision was made to arrest Donovan at the rectory rather than at the church during services, with plainclothes officers positioned to ensure he couldn't flee if he somehow became aware of the impending arrest. The operation was scheduled for 7 a.m. on October 19th, 5 days after the murders and 3 days into the investigation. The arrest itself was captured on body cameras, showing Father Donovan opening the rectory door in his bathrobe, momentarily freezing as he recognized Brooks and Fernandez, accompanied by 4 uniformed officers. "Father Michael Donovan, you're under arrest for the murders of Robert Brandy, Sophia, and Thomas Isaacs," Brooks stated formally, his voice steady as he read the priest his Miranda rights. Donovan's face, initially registering shock, quickly composed itself into a mask of dignified denial as he requested to dress before being taken to the station. The officers allowed this, with female detective Fernandez and a female officer accompanying him to his bedroom to ensure he didn't attempt to destroy evidence or harm himself, a precaution that proved unnecessary as Donovan dressed silently, his clerical collar left untouched on the dresser as he opted for civilian clothes. News of the arrest spread rapidly through Phoenix, with local stations breaking into regular programming to report that the beloved priest of St. Catherine's had been arrested for the quadruple homicide of a parish family. The initial public reaction was predominantly disbelief, with many parishioners gathering outside the police station in spontaneous vigil, some holding signs proclaiming Father Donovan's innocence, and others simply praying in confused anguish. Maria Gonzalez, who had served as the church's office administrator for over a decade, told reporters through tears, "There must be some terrible mistake. Father Michael baptized my grandchildren. He visits the sick in hospitals every week. He couldn't possibly do what they're saying." While public sentiment initially favored Donovan, investigators continued building their case methodically, with Brooks conducting a thorough background investigation into the priest's life before he came to St. Catherine's. What emerged was a pattern of short tenures at parishes across 3 different dioceses, always moving before completing a full accounting cycle at any single location. Most significantly, Brooks discovered that Donovan had briefly studied medicine at Johns Hopkins University before abruptly leaving the program and entering the seminary, providing a possible explanation for the precision of certain wounds noted by the medical examiner. A former classmate from Johns Hopkins, now a surgeon in Baltimore, told investigators that Donovan had shown particular interest in vascular anatomy during their studies, often practicing techniques in the lab well after others had left. The financial motive grew stronger as FBI agents traced the embezzled funds, discovering that Father Donovan had been using the money to make strategic investments in technology, stocks, and real estate, growing the original theft into a portfolio worth nearly $4 million. Bank records showed regular withdrawals from these accounts, funding luxury vacations to destinations including Monaco, Bali, and the Maldives, trips the priest had described to his congregation as spiritual retreats or missionary work. The dual life Donovan had constructed was meticulous in its separation. In Phoenix, he played the role of the humble, dedicated priest, while in his financial dealings and during his travels, he lived as a wealthy, sophisticated investor with expensive tastes. The connection between Robert Isaacs's discovery and the timing of the murders was cemented when investigators recovered deleted emails from Donovan's computer showing he had been blind copied on a message Robert sent to the diocese financial board on October 13th, requesting the emergency meeting and indicating he had evidence of serious financial malfeasance requiring immediate attention. This email, sent just 1 day before the murders, suggested Donovan had become aware that his scheme was about to be exposed, creating an urgent motive to silence Robert before the scheduled meeting. The prosecution would later argue that the decision to kill the entire family stemmed from Robert's pattern of working closely with his wife and daughter on church matters, making it likely they were also aware of his findings. Additional evidence linking Father Donovan to the crime scene continued to emerge as the investigation progressed. Fiber analysis matched carpet fibers found on Donovan's shoes to the distinctive Berber carpet in the Isaacs master bedroom, where the most violent attack had occurred. Cell phone tower data placed Donovan's phone in the vicinity of the crime scene during the critical window, despite his claim to have been at the rectory. Most damning partial fingerprints found on a water glass in the Isaacs kitchen matched the priest, suggesting he had been welcomed into the home as a trusted visitor before carrying out the attacks, which aligned with the fact that the home's alarm system had been properly deactivated rather than bypassed. By the time Father Michael Donovan was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of aggravated theft on October 20th, the case against him had grown from a single DNA match to a comprehensive web of evidence, establishing motive, means, opportunity, and a pattern of deception spanning years. What began as a shocking accusation against a trusted community figure had evolved into a solid case built on scientific evidence, financial forensics, and the meticulous detective work of the Phoenix Police Department. As prosecutor Sophia Wilson prepared for the preliminary hearing, she summarized the state's position to the media. This case represents the ultimate betrayal, not just of a family's trust, but of an entire community's faith in someone they believed represented moral authority. The stage was set for what would become one of the most high-profile murder trials in Arizona history, with a man of the cloth facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars for crimes committed to protect a secret life funded by the very donations his parishioners believed were serving God's work. The Phoenix Police Department's Criminal Investigation Bureau established a dedicated task force for the Isaacs family murders, with Detective Logan Brooks appointed as lead investigator overseeing a team that grew to include 15 detectives, 4 forensic accountants, and specialists from both the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and the Arizona Attorney General's office. Workspace was cleared in the department's largest conference room, its walls soon covered with timeline charts, financial flow diagrams, and photographs of the victims and crime scene, creating what officers began calling the War Room. Brooks implemented a rigorous evidence review protocol, requiring all team members to convene daily at 8:00 a.m. and 5:00 p.m. to share findings and coordinate investigative angles, ensuring no potential lead went unexplored and no piece of evidence remained unconnected to the broader narrative they were constructing around Father Michael Donovan's guilt. The DNA evidence from beneath Brandy Isaacs' fingernails remained the cornerstone of the physical case, with Dr. Aisha Johnson conducting additional validation tests to ensure the match to Father Donovan was unassailable in court. "We've gone well beyond standard protocols," Dr. Johnson explained to Brooks during one of the daily briefings, her precise language reflecting her awareness that she would eventually need to explain these results to a jury. The sample contains not just epithelial cells, but also blood that matches Donovan's type, suggesting Brandy managed to break his skin during the struggle, which explains the defensive positioning of her arms noted in the autopsy. This blood evidence was particularly significant because it indicated active resistance by Brandy, countering any potential defense claim that Donovan's DNA might have been transferred through casual contact during his regular interactions with the family as their priest. Forensic analysis of the murder weapon provided another crucial link in the evidentiary chain when CSI technicians discovered microscopic blood residue in the drain of Father Donovan's bathroom sink, despite evidence of thorough cleaning with bleach-based products. This blood, when analyzed, contained DNA from all 4 Isaacs family members, as well as Donovan himself, suggesting he had cleaned the knife used in the murders in his own bathroom. The hunting knife purchased 2 days before the murders was never recovered. But the wound patterns documented in the autopsies matched the specifications of the knife shown on the receipt found in Donovan's vehicle, and surveillance footage from the hardware store 40 miles outside Phoenix clearly showed the priest making the purchase while wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses in an apparent attempt to conceal his identity. The financial investigation expanded significantly under the direction of FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh, who obtained international cooperation to access records from banks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. "What we're seeing is a textbook example of sophisticated embezzlement," Walsh explained during a joint briefing with the prosecution team. Donovan created a layered system that diverted funds through a series of legitimate-appearing transactions, taking advantage of his exclusive access to certain church accounts and the trust placed in him by the Parish Financial Committee. Walsh's team constructed a comprehensive flow chart documenting how donations intended for church renovations, mission work, and community outreach had instead funded Donovan's secret investment portfolio and luxury lifestyle, with the total misappropriated funds now estimated at closer to $2.5 million when interest and investment returns were included. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Sophia Wilson, began organizing the evidence into a narrative that would be compelling to a jury, focusing on 3 key elements: the financial motive established through Robert Isaacs's discovery of the embezzlement, the DNA and blood evidence linking Donovan directly to the crime scene, and the premeditation demonstrated through his purchases of murder implements and internet search history. "We need to tell the story of betrayal on multiple levels," Wilson instructed her team during a strategy session. Betrayal of his religious vows, betrayal of his congregation's financial trust, and ultimately, the betrayal that led him to murder an entire family who had welcomed him into their home and hearts. This narrative approach would later prove effective in helping jurors process the difficult concept that a spiritual leader could commit such heinous acts. Digital forensics specialists recovered deleted text messages from Father Donovan's phone, revealing his growing panic in the days before the murders. On October 11th, the day after Robert Isaacs likely discovered the embezzlement, Donovan texted a friend in another state, "Might need to take an extended vacation soon. Things getting complicated here." On October 13th, he searched online for countries with no U.S. extradition and how to live overseas with cash only, suggesting he was considering flight as his first option before apparently deciding that eliminating the threat posed by the Isaacs family would allow him to maintain his position and lifestyle. These digital breadcrumbs created a psychological profile of a man growing increasingly desperate as his years of deception neared exposure. The investigation into Donovan's background uncovered additional relevant history that prosecutors planned to use to establish pattern and character. Before joining the priesthood, Donovan had been dismissed from a position at a private school in Pennsylvania after allegations of misappropriating student activity funds. Though no charges were filed after he returned the money and claimed accounting errors, his seminary record showed he had been placed on probation for unauthorized use of diocesan credit cards, an issue apparently resolved through mentorship and additional supervision. These incidents, while minor compared to the current charges, established a pattern of financial impropriety and an increasing comfort with deception that prosecutors argued had escalated over time. Witness interviews provided crucial context for both the financial crimes and the murders themselves. Church Secretary Eleanor Vasquez recounted instances where Donovan had insisted on personally handling certain donations, particularly large ones from wealthy parishioners, circumventing normal accounting procedures. He always said it was to provide special recognition to significant donors, Vasquez told detectives. But looking back, those were the exact donations that never seemed to make it into the regular financial reports. Similarly, the church's maintenance manager, Thomas Griffin, described being repeatedly denied funds for necessary repairs, despite fundraising campaigns specifically for those projects, with Donovan claiming the money had been temporarily allocated to more pressing needs that Griffin now realized were fictitious. The most emotionally powerful testimony came from Brandy Isaacs' sister, Carolyn Mitchell, who described a phone call she received from Brandy just 2 days before the murders. "She sounded worried, which wasn't like her at all," Mitchell recounted through tears during her recorded statement. "She told me Robert had found something serious at the church, that it involved money and Father Michael, and that they were trying to figure out the right way to handle it. She said she was praying for guidance because the truth was going to hurt a lot of people who trusted him." This conversation not only confirmed the family's knowledge of the embezzlement, but also revealed their characteristic thoughtfulness in considering the impact the revelation would have on their church community, a consideration their killer clearly did not share. As the case built against Father Donovan solidified, investigators faced the challenge of addressing potential defense strategies. The most likely defense argument, that Donovan's DNA could have been transferred to Brandy through innocent contact as their priest, was countered by the specific location and nature of the DNA evidence. The samples were embedded deep under her fingernails, consistent with a defensive scratching action, Dr. Johnson explained in her final report. Additionally, the presence of Donovan's blood mixed with the epithelial cells indicates a forceful exchange that could only occur during a violent struggle, not casual contact. Similarly, the defense might suggest alternate suspects, particularly given the staged appearance of a home invasion. But the combination of DNA, financial motive, and premeditative evidence created an overwhelming case specifically against Donovan. The prosecution team, working closely with detectives, constructed a detailed timeline of the murders that would later be presented to the jury. According to their reconstruction, Father Donovan arrived at the Isaacs home around 10 p.m., likely under the pretense of discussing church matters, and was welcomed inside as a trusted spiritual advisor. At some point during the evening, Donovan attacked Robert first, probably while he was examining financial documents, incapacitating him quickly to prevent resistance. Brandy, hearing the disturbance, came to her husband's aid and fought with Donovan, scratching him deeply enough to draw blood and deposit his DNA under her fingernails before being overcome. The children were likely killed last, possibly after being restrained to prevent escape while Donovan dealt with their parents, explaining the different patterns of violence observed in the various victims. By the time the case was presented to the grand jury on November 5, 2023, 3 weeks after the murders, the prosecution had assembled what District Attorney Manuel Rodriguez described as one of the most comprehensive and compelling cases of premeditated murder I've seen in my 20-year career. The grand jury indicted Father Michael Donovan on 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of grand theft, and multiple financial crimes related to the embezzlement. The priest, who had been held without bail since his arrest due to flight risk concerns, was scheduled for arraignment the following week, where he would formally enter his plea before the court and the community he had betrayed through both financial exploitation and ultimate violence. The case that had begun with a desperate mother's final act of defense, scratching her attacker and preserving his DNA under her fingernails, had expanded into a comprehensive picture of greed, deception, and cold-blooded murder that would soon be presented to 12 jurors tasked with delivering justice for the Isaacs family. The tactical team assembled outside St. Catherine's Rectory at 6:30 a.m. on October 19, 2023, strategically positioning officers at all potential exits, while Detective Logan Brooks and Detective Maya Fernandez approached the main door with 4 uniformed officers. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the church grounds as Brooks, wearing a bulletproof vest beneath his suit jacket, raised his hand to knock, his expression betraying none of the tension evident in his tightly clenched jaw. "Phoenix Police Department," he announced clearly, his voice deliberately calibrated to project authority without aggression, conscious that neighbors might be watching. "Father Donovan, we need to speak with you immediately." The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes before shuffling sounds came from inside, followed by the click of multiple locks being disengaged, revealing the priest in a navy blue bathrobe, his hair disheveled from sleep, but his eyes instantly alert and assessing the situation with a calculating gaze that Brooks would later describe as completely incongruent with his cultivated persona of pastoral gentleness. "Father Michael Donovan," Brooks stated formally, maintaining direct eye contact with the priest while Fernandez positioned herself slightly to the side, her hand resting near her service weapon. "You're under arrest for the murders of Robert Brandy, Sophia, and Thomas Isaacs." Donovan's face registered a series of rapid micro-expressions: shock, fear, calculation, and finally, a carefully composed mask of dignified confusion. "There must be some terrible mistake," he responded, his voice steady despite the circumstances, the practiced cadence of his pastoral tone evident even in this moment of crisis. "I'd like to help clarify whatever misunderstanding has occurred." Brooks continued the formal process, reading Donovan his Miranda rights, while uniformed officers moved into position beside the priest, who requested permission to dress before being transported to the station, a request that was granted with the stipulation that officers would accompany him to ensure he didn't attempt to destroy evidence or harm himself. The arrest was conducted with minimal disturbance to the surrounding neighborhood, the police vehicles deliberately unmarked and the officers in plain clothes where possible, reflecting Brooks's concern about the community impact of seeing their spiritual leader taken into custody. News of the arrest, nevertheless, spread rapidly through Phoenix, with local media outlets broadcasting live from outside the police station by mid-morning as Donovan was led inside, now dressed in a simple gray sweater and black pants, having deliberately avoided his clerical collar, a detail that would not go unnoticed by prosecutors building a case around his dual identity. A small crowd of parishioners began gathering outside the station, their expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to angry denial, many clutching rosaries or holding improvised signs proclaiming, "Father Michael is innocent, and we stand with our priest," unaware of the mounting evidence linking the man they trusted to the brutal murder of a family from their own congregation. The interrogation room at Phoenix Police Headquarters was deliberately austere, containing only a metal table bolted to the floor, 4 chairs, and a one-way observation mirror with video cameras mounted in 2 corners to record the proceedings from multiple angles. Donovan was processed according to standard procedures, photographed, fingerprinted, and allowed to consult briefly with a public defender before the formal questioning began at 9:17 a.m. Detective Brooks entered the room first, carrying a thin folder that suggested limited evidence despite the substantial case already built, a tactical decision to encourage Donovan to speak freely rather than immediately recognize the strength of the case against him. "Thank you for your cooperation this morning, Father Donovan," Brooks began, his tone professional but not overtly hostile, establishing a rhythm of formality that would characterize the initial phase of the interrogation. The interview strategy, developed in consultation with FBI behavioral analysts, focused on gradually transitioning from open-ended questions about Donovan's relationship with the Isaacs family to increasingly specific inquiries about his whereabouts on the night of the murders. "You've been their parish priest for how long now?" Brooks asked, allowing Donovan to describe his ministerial role with the family, which he did with apparent sincerity, speaking of baptizing Thomas, counseling Robert and Brandy through marriage difficulties years earlier, and mentoring Sophia as she took on responsibilities at the church. "They were a special family, deeply faithful," Donovan stated, maintaining steady eye contact with Brooks while speaking of the victims in a tone of genuine affection that was so convincing it momentarily gave the detective pause despite the evidence. "I'm still struggling to understand who could do something so horrific to people who brought so much good to our community." Detective Fernandez entered the room 40 minutes into the interview, carrying a larger file folder and a tablet computer, her arrival marking a shift in approach as the questions became more pointed. "Father Donovan, can you explain to us again your movements on Saturday, October 14th, specifically between the hours of 9:00 p.m. and 1:00 a.m.? She asked, her tone remaining professional, but with an edge of skepticism that had been absent from Brooks's questioning. Donovan repeated his previous statement about conducting evening confessions until 8:30 p.m., then returning to the rectory with a migraine, where he spent the evening reading and praying before retiring early, a timeline he claimed could not be corroborated by witnesses, but which he offered with the confident assertion that "my word has always been sufficient in matters of truth within my community." The tactical shift came at 10:45 a.m., when Brooks placed a photograph on the table showing the receipt for latex gloves, duct tape, and a hunting knife purchased at a hardware store outside Phoenix. "This was found in your vehicle, Father," Brooks stated flatly, watching Donovan's face closely for reaction. The purchase was made on October 12th, 2 days after Robert Isaacs discovered discrepancies in the church finances and 2 days before the entire family was murdered. Donovan's composure slipped momentarily, his left hand twitching slightly before he folded both hands together on the table in a gesture reminiscent of prayer. "I don't recall making that purchase," he responded after a calculated pause, his voice slightly higher than before. "Perhaps someone borrowed my car, or this is another mistake in what seems to be an increasingly confused investigation." Fernandez followed immediately with digital evidence, turning the tablet to show Donovan his own internet search history recovered from his devices, searches for fatal stab wounds, staging crime scenes, and DNA evidence. "These were deleted from your computer, Father, but our technical team recovered them," she explained, her tone now openly confrontational. "They were conducted in the days immediately before the Isaacs family was murdered, exactly as these searches described." Donovan's response was to request water, a delay tactic that Brooks recognized from years of interrogations, though he granted the request, using the brief interruption to recalibrate their approach as Donovan's defensive posture became more pronounced, his initial cooperativeness giving way to increasingly terse responses and frequent invocations of potential misunderstandings. The definitive moment in the interrogation came at 11:23 a.m., when Brooks placed a final photograph on the table, an electron microscope image of skin cells. "This is your DNA, Father Donovan," he stated without emotion, watching the priest's eyes widen almost imperceptibly. "It was found under Brandy Isaacs's fingernails. She scratched you while fighting for her life, didn't she?" The silence that followed lasted 17 seconds. Brooks counted them internally, before Donovan cleared his throat and responded with the first direct lie of the interrogation. "I have no idea how that could be possible. Perhaps I shook her hand at church that morning, and she hadn't washed before." Brooks cut him off, his voice remaining level but carrying undeniable authority. "This isn't casual transfer, Father. These cells were embedded deeply under her nails, along with your blood. She scratched you hard enough to break your skin while you were attacking her." Donovan's demeanor transformed at this revelation, his pastoral mask slipping to reveal a calculating coldness that startled even the experienced detectives. "I think I should speak with my attorney before continuing this conversation," he stated flatly, sitting back in his chair and folding his arms across his chest, physically closing himself off from further engagement. Brooks nodded once, acknowledging the request, while making a final observation. "It's interesting that you didn't ask for a lawyer when we showed you the receipt for murder supplies or your searches on how to kill someone and stage a crime scene. It was only when we presented scientific evidence that directly places you at the scene that you decided to stop talking." Donovan made no response, his gaze now fixed on the wall behind the detectives, his expression unreadable as the first phase of interrogation concluded at 11:31 a.m. After consulting with the prosecutor's office, detectives allowed Donovan to meet with a court-appointed attorney for 1 hour, before resuming questioning at 12:45 p.m., now with the attorney present. The dynamic shifted dramatically, with Donovan remaining silent, while his counsel, Patricia Morales, a public defender with 20 years' experience, spoke on his behalf. "My client maintains his innocence and will not be answering further questions at this time," Morales stated firmly, requesting details of the evidence against Donovan, which Brooks provided in broad terms without revealing investigative specifics that might compromise the ongoing case building. "We have physical evidence placing your client at the murder scene, financial documentation establishing motive, and evidence of premeditation, including purchases of items used in the crime and internet searches demonstrating intent," Brooks summarized, addressing Morales while Donovan sat motionless beside her, his eyes now focused on his hands folded on the table. The formal charging process proceeded following the interrogation, with Donovan processed into the Maricopa County Jail under special protective custody, given his status as both a clergyman and a high-profile murder suspect. At the initial court appearance later that day, prosecutor Sophia Wilson argued successfully against bail, citing the extreme nature of the crimes, the substantial evidence of premeditation, and Donovan's research into countries without extradition treaties as evidence of flight risk. The defendant has demonstrated both the capacity for extreme violence and the resources to flee justice, Wilson argued before Judge Anthony Ramirez. His position as a trusted religious figure allowed him to enter the victim's home without suspicion before committing these horrific crimes, and that same position provided him access to financial resources far beyond his official salary. Judge Ramirez ordered Donovan held without bail pending trial, setting the preliminary hearing for November 10, 2023. The hours following Donovan's arrest and interrogation saw the investigation accelerate as search warrants were executed simultaneously at the church rectory, Donovan's vehicle, and a storage unit registered in his name, discovered through financial records. The search of the rectory revealed a hidden compartment behind a bookcase in Donovan's office containing $37,000 in cash, 3 passports under different names with Donovan's photograph, and a notebook detailing offshore account numbers not previously identified in the financial investigation. In the storage unit, investigators discovered a suitcase containing clothing with traces of blood that preliminary testing matched to Robert Isaacs. Apparently packed for disposal but not yet eliminated, a critical error that provided additional physical evidence linking Donovan directly to the murders. Public reaction to Donovan's arrest evolved rapidly as details of the evidence against him began to emerge through official statements and inevitable leaks from within the investigation. The initial shock and disbelief among parishioners gave way to anger and profound betrayal as the financial crimes became public knowledge, with many struggling to reconcile their personal experiences of spiritual guidance with the mounting evidence that their trusted priest had systematically stolen from their donations for years before ultimately murdering a family to conceal his crimes. Support for Donovan diminished as church members realized the full scope of his deception, though a small core of dedicated followers maintained belief in his innocence, forming a prayer group that held vigils outside the jail and raising funds for his legal defense through online campaigns that generated significant controversy in the broader Phoenix community. Bishop Anthony Morales of the Phoenix Diocese held a press conference 3 days after Donovan's arrest, expressing profound sorrow and shame over the allegations, while announcing an independent audit of all diocesan finances and the establishment of a support fund for parishioners traumatized by the events. The actions alleged against Father Donovan represent the most fundamental betrayal of everything the priesthood stands for, Bishop Morales stated, his voice breaking with emotion. Our first concern now is for the extended family of the victims and for the parishioners who place their trust in a man who appears to have violated that trust in the most heinous way imaginable. The diocese immediately removed Donovan from his position and began the canonical process for laicization, the formal removal of his status as a priest, proceeding in parallel with the criminal case against him. The interrogation of Father Michael Donovan ultimately yielded little in terms of confession or explanation, his initial cooperativeness giving way to strategic silence once confronted with irrefutable evidence. Yet the process revealed crucial insights into his psychology that would later inform the prosecution's presentation at trial, particularly the distinct shift in demeanor when his carefully constructed public persona gave way to cold calculation. As Detective Brooks noted in his case summary, Donovan's most telling response was not what he said, but when he chose to stop speaking. His willingness to engage until presented with the DNA evidence suggests he believed he could talk his way out of circumstantial connections, but recognized the scientific evidence as insurmountable. This observation would prove prescient as the case moved toward trial, with Donovan maintaining his silence, while his defense team worked to undermine the narrative constructed by prosecutors, a narrative built on the foundation of a desperate mother's final act of resistance that preserved her killer's identity beneath her fingernails. The Maricopa County Superior Court in downtown Phoenix stood as a monument to justice, its modern glass and concrete structure contrasting with the classical columns of the adjacent historic courthouse, a visual representation of the balance between tradition and progress in the legal system. On the morning of January 8, 2024, nearly 3 months after the murders of the Isaacs family, the building became the center of national attention as the trial of Father Michael Donovan began under extraordinary security measures. Media trucks lined the streets surrounding the courthouse, satellite dishes extending skyward like mechanical flowers searching for the sun, while journalists from across the country jostled for position near the entrance, eager to capture the arrival of the man one cable news network had already dubbed the Deadly Priest. Inside, Courtroom 305 had been specially prepared for the high-profile case, with additional seating installed to accommodate the expected crowd, and clear barriers erected between the gallery and the trial participants, a precaution reflecting both the emotional nature of the case and threats that had been made against the defendant since his arrest. Judge Elena Martinez entered the courtroom at precisely 9:01 a.m., her reputation for punctuality and strict procedural adherence preceding her as the assembled crowd rose in unison at the bailiff's command. At 63, Judge Martinez brought nearly 20 years of judicial experience to the bench, her silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a severe bun that complemented her no-nonsense approach to courtroom management. "Be seated," she instructed, after taking her place, her voice carrying easily through the hushed space as she surveyed the packed gallery with a practiced eye. This court understands the significant public interest in these proceedings, but I will remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a theater. Disruptions will not be tolerated, and anyone unable to maintain appropriate decorum will be removed immediately and barred from returning. Her gaze lingered briefly on the media section before she nodded to the bailiff, signaling for the defendant to be brought in. Father Michael Donovan entered the courtroom through a side door, accompanied by his defense attorneys and 2 court officers, his appearance markedly changed from the confident priest who had led services at St. Catherine's just months earlier. The 3 months of incarceration had thinned his frame, and his once-styled brown hair had grown out unevenly, with strands of premature gray, now visible at his temples, despite being only 38 years old. He wore a charcoal gray suit that appeared slightly too large for his diminished physique, a conservative blue tie, and wire-rimmed glasses that his defense team had suggested to soften his appearance before the jury. The absence of his clerical collar was conspicuous, a strategic decision by his attorneys to separate his current legal situation from his religious role, though the prosecution would later argue this visual transformation was yet another performance from a man who had lived a double life for years. The defense team was led by James Harrington, a prominent Phoenix attorney known for handling high-profile cases, whose services had been secured through an anonymous donation to Donovan's legal fund, a contribution later revealed to have come from the priest's own hidden accounts. Harrington projected confident competence, his tailored navy suit and silver hair creating an image of distinguished authority as he guided Donovan to his seat at the defense table, leaning close to whisper something that caused the former priest to nod almost imperceptibly before fixing his gaze straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with the gallery where both supporters and those who had lost faith in him waited to witness the proceedings. Flanking Harrington were 2 junior attorneys and a paralegal, a team assembled specifically for this case with expertise in forensic evidence challenges, financial crimes, and jury psychology. Across the aisle, the prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Sophia Wilson, whose reputation for methodical preparation and compelling courtroom narrative had earned her the assignment to what the district attorneys office considered its most significant case in decades. At 45, Wilson had prosecuted over 50 murder cases with a conviction rate above 90%, her approach characterized by meticulous attention to detail and an ability to humanize victims while clearly establishing the legal elements of crimes charged. Beside her sat Assistant Prosecutor Marcus Chen, specializing in financial crimes, and Sarah Okoya, an experienced litigator who would handle witness examinations, forming a team carefully balanced to address both the emotional horror of the murders and the complex financial scheme that motivated them. The gallery was filled to capacity, with the first 2 rows reserved for family members of the victims, including Brandy Isaacs's parents, Gerald and Marion Cooper, their faces etched with grief as they steadfastly avoided looking at the man accused of murdering their daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren. Behind them sat colleagues from Robert's accounting firm, teachers from Brandy's school, and classmates of Sophia and Thomas, a cross-section of a community irrevocably altered by the loss of a family that had touched so many lives. The remainder of the gallery was divided between media representatives, members of St. Catherine's Parish with conflicting views on their former priest's guilt, and regular citizens who had waited in line since before dawn to secure a seat at what had become the most discussed trial in Phoenix history. After preliminary matters were addressed, including rulings on several motions regarding evidence admissibility, Judge Martinez turned to the jury selection process, which had been conducted over the previous week with painstaking care to identify jurors capable of impartiality despite the extensive pre-trial publicity. The final panel consisted of 9 women and 3 men, with 4 alternates representing diverse backgrounds, including a retired teacher, an IT specialist, a construction foreman, and a nurse, each having satisfied both the court and counsel that they could evaluate the evidence objectively despite the emotional nature of the charges. As the jurors filed in and took their places in the jury box, Judge Martinez addressed them directly. You have been selected to perform one of the most important civic duties our society requires, determining the facts in a case where a man's freedom and the public's safety hang in the balance. You must set aside anything you may have heard before today and judge this case solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom. The formal reading of charges by the court clerk underscored the gravity of the proceedings. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of grand theft exceeding $1 million, and multiple counts of financial fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. With each charge, several jurors visibly reacted, eyes widening or brows furrowing as the scope of the alleged crimes became clear. When asked for his plea, Donovan rose slowly, his voice steady, but noticeably quieter than during his days at the pulpit, stating not guilty to each charge before returning to his seat with the careful movements of a man who understood he was being scrutinized by every person in the room. Prosecutor Sophia Wilson approached the podium for her opening statement at 10:17 a.m., taking a moment to arrange her notes before looking directly at the jury, establishing eye contact with each member before beginning to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying a natural authority that commanded attention without seeming forceful, this case is about betrayal on an unimaginable scale, the betrayal of financial trust, the betrayal of spiritual authority, and ultimately the betrayal that led to the brutal murders of an entire family who simply sought the truth. She paused, allowing the weight of these words to settle before continuing. The evidence will show that the defendant, Michael Donovan, systematically embezzled $2.3 million from St. Catherine's Church over 8 years, using funds donated by parishioners for their church, their community outreach programs, and their charitable works to instead finance a secret life of luxury, investments, and international travel. Wilson moved from behind the podium, standing directly before the jury as she transitioned to the events leading to the murders. Her movements deliberate but natural as she established the timeline. Robert Isaacs discovering financial irregularities during a voluntary audit of church finances, scheduling a meeting with diocese officials, and the defendant learning of this imminent exposure. Robert Isaacs was doing what he had volunteered to do, ensuring the financial integrity of his church. For that, he, his wife, and their 2 children paid with their lives. Wilson then methodically outlined the physical evidence that would be presented: the DNA from beneath Brandy Isaacs' fingernails, the blood evidence found in Donovan's residence, the purchase of items used in the crimes, and the digital footprint of research into murder methods and evidence concealment. The emotional center of Wilson's opening came when she displayed photographs of the Isaacs family on the courtroom's evidence screens, not crime scene photos, but images of them in life. Robert coaching Thomas's baseball team, Brandy with her elementary school class, Sophia at her debate competition, and the family together at a church picnic. These are the lives that were extinguished when the defendant decided that protecting his scheme was worth more than this family's right to exist, Wilson stated, her voice firm but tinged with controlled emotion. Robert, Brandy, Sophia, and Thomas Isaacs will never attend another baseball game, teach another child, win another debate, or share another family dinner because the defendant made a calculation that their lives were an acceptable price for his continued freedom and access to stolen funds. Wilson concluded her opening by directly addressing the most challenging aspect of the case for many jurors: reconciling the defendant's public persona as a spiritual leader with the crimes charged. You will hear testimony from people who trusted the defendant, who believed in his role as their priest and spiritual guide. The evidence will show that this trust was exploited not just to steal their donations, but to gain entry to the Isaacs home on the night of October 14, 2023, where he committed 4 calculated, premeditated murders to silence the family who had discovered his years of theft. Her final words established the central narrative the prosecution would build. This case is not about faith or religion. It is about a man who wore the collar of trust while living a life of deception, and who, when faced with exposure, chose murder over accountability. The evidence will prove this beyond any reasonable doubt. Defense attorney James Harrington approached the podium as Wilson returned to the prosecution table, his manner deliberately more subdued, creating a contrast in tone that would characterize his entire opening statement. The prosecution has just painted a compelling picture for you, he began, acknowledging Wilson's effectiveness while subtly planting the first seed of doubt. It's a narrative that makes sense of a tragedy that otherwise seems senseless. But narratives, no matter how compelling, are not evidence, and evidence is what this trial must be about. Harrington's strategy immediately became clear. He would position the prosecution's case as an emotionally satisfying story that lacked substantive proof, appealing to the juror's duty to require evidence beyond reasonable doubt. Harrington systematically addressed each category of evidence mentioned by Wilson, suggesting alternative explanations that the defense would explore during trial. The DNA evidence that the prosecution considers so damning, you will hear expert testimony about how such evidence can be transferred through completely innocent contact, particularly between individuals who interacted regularly in a church community. He moved on to the financial allegations, acknowledging irregularities in church accounting, but suggesting they resulted from outdated systems, volunteer management, and lack of professional oversight, rather than deliberate embezzlement by his client. The prosecution wants you to believe that complex financial transactions across multiple accounts over 8 years were the work of one man with no formal financial training, rather than the result of systemic problems that existed before Father Donovan ever arrived at St. Catherine's. The defense's opening reached its strategic apex when Harrington addressed the most difficult evidence to explain away Donovan's internet searches and purchases before the murders. We live in an age where our digital footprints can be manipulated, where devices can be accessed without our knowledge, and where coincidence can appear as conspiracy to those already convinced of guilt. He paused, making eye contact with several jurors who had noted earlier on their questionnaires that they worked in technology fields. The prosecution's timeline assumes that because certain searches were conducted on devices associated with Father Donovan, he must have been the one conducting them. You will hear evidence that multiple people had access to the rectory, to Father Donovan's office, and potentially to his devices. Harrington concluded by directly challenging the prosecution's narrative of betrayal, offering an alternative framing. What if the real betrayal here is not by Father Donovan, but of Father Donovan? What if an innocent man who dedicated his life to spiritual service is being scapegoated for crimes committed by someone who understood the church's financial systems well enough to exploit them and Father Donovan's trust? He gestured toward his client, who maintained a solemn, dignified expression. The prosecution must prove every element of these charges beyond reasonable doubt. When you hear all the evidence, not just the narrative that makes for a satisfying explanation of tragedy, you will find that reasonable doubt exists in abundance. And when it does, your duty will be clear, a verdict of not guilty on all counts. As opening statements concluded, and Judge Martinez called the mid-morning recess, the battle lines of the trial had been clearly drawn. The prosecution would build a case based on scientific evidence, financial forensics, and the logical progression from embezzlement discovery to premeditated murder. The defense would work to create reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative explanations for each piece of evidence, implying that Donovan himself might be a victim rather than a perpetrator. When court resumed, the prosecution would call its first witness, Dr. Thomas Chen, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsies on all 4 victims, beginning the methodical presentation of evidence that would determine whether justice would be served for the Isaacs family and whether Michael Donovan would spend the rest of his life in prison for crimes that had shaken the foundations of faith in an entire community. Dr. Thomas Chen approached the witness stand on the trial's 3rd day, his posture ramrod straight and his movements deliberate, reflecting both his military background before entering forensic medicine and the gravity with which he approached his testimony. At 57, with 22 years of experience as a medical examiner and having performed over 4,000 autopsies, Dr. Chen represented the prosecution's first expert witness, tasked with establishing the clinical facts of the murders while humanizing the victims through his detailed observations. After being sworn in and establishing his credentials without challenge from the defense, Dr. Chen faced prosecutor Sophia Wilson, who guided him through a carefully structured examination designed to build a foundation of irrefutable physical evidence upon which the prosecution's case would rest. Dr. Chen, Wilson began, could you please explain to the jury your involvement in the investigation of the deaths of the Isaacs family? Dr. Chen detailed his arrival at the crime scene on October 16, 2023, and his preliminary examination of the bodies before their transport to the medical examiner's facility, where he personally conducted all 4 autopsies over a 36-hour period. Using anatomical diagrams rather than the graphic autopsy photographs, which Judge Martinez had ruled would be shown only during deliberations if specifically requested by the jury, Dr. Chen methodically described the wounds suffered by each victim, beginning with Robert Isaacs. The father sustained 17 stab wounds, primarily to the chest and neck area, with 3 that penetrated the heart and would have been individually fatal. The doctor indicated the locations on the diagram projected on the courtroom screen, his laser pointer tracing the pattern of injuries as he explained the force, angle, and likely sequence of wounds. The pattern and depth of injuries indicate the attacker was right-handed and struck with significant downward force, consistent with someone standing over the victim who was likely already prone or seated when the attack began. When Wilson asked about defensive wounds, Dr. Chen's testimony took a crucial turn that directly supported the prosecution's timeline of events. Robert Isaacs had minimal defensive wounds, just slight bruising on his forearms consistent with reflexive protection, but not the type of injuries typically seen in someone who has time to actively defend themselves. Dr. Chen continued, explaining the significance. This suggests the attack on Robert was sudden, possibly while he was distracted or even partially asleep, giving him little opportunity to resist effectively. This testimony aligned perfectly with the prosecution's theory that Donovan had attacked Robert first, knowing he represented the primary threat due to his discovery of the embezzlement scheme. The testimony regarding Brandy Isaacs painted a dramatically different picture, with Dr. Chen describing extensive defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. Mrs. Isaacs had deep lacerations on both palms and the inner surfaces of all fingers, consistent with attempting to grab or deflect a blade. Using a different diagram, he showed jurors the location of what he termed terminal defensive wounds on her forearms. These injuries tell us she was awake and actively fighting her attacker for a significant period before the fatal wounds were inflicted. Most critically, Dr. Chen confirmed the collection of biological samples from beneath Brandy's fingernails at his specific direction after observing what appeared to be tissue and blood not belonging to the victim. Based on the depth of the scratches on her hands and the material recovered from beneath her nails, it is my professional opinion that Mrs. Isaacs managed to scratch her attacker with sufficient force to remove skin cells and draw blood. The courtroom fell completely silent as Dr. Chen moved on to describe the wounds suffered by Sophia and Thomas Isaacs, his clinical language unable to fully mask the emotional impact of discussing children who had been murdered in their beds. Sophia had 9 stab wounds, primarily to her chest and neck, with evidence suggesting she had awakened during the attack based on defensive wounds similar to, but less extensive, than her mother's. Thomas, the youngest victim at 13, had 7 wounds concentrated in a tight pattern over his heart, with minimal defensive injuries, suggesting he may have been killed while still asleep or just waking. Dr. Chen noted distinctive bruising patterns on both children's wrists and ankles. These contusions are consistent with restraints, possibly zip ties or similar bindings, applied before death and removed afterward. During cross-examination, defense attorney James Harrington attempted to introduce alternative interpretations of the wound patterns, focusing particularly on the possibility that multiple attackers might have been involved. Dr. Chen, isn't it true that the variation in wound depth and angle across different victims could indicate different assailants rather than a single attacker adjusting to different circumstances? Dr. Chen acknowledged this was theoretically possible, but countered with specific evidence that contradicted this theory. While the number and distribution of wounds varied between victims, the blade, width, angle of penetration, and force application show remarkable consistency across all 4 victims, strongly suggesting a single attacker using the same weapon throughout. This exchange set a pattern that would repeat throughout the trial, with the defense attempting to introduce reasonable doubt, while prosecution witnesses repeatedly closed those avenues with specific scientific explanations. The DNA evidence that formed the cornerstone of the prosecution's physical case was presented by Dr. Aisha Johnson, the Phoenix Crime Lab's chief DNA analyst, whose testimony on Day 5 of the trial was anticipated by both legal teams as potentially decisive. After establishing Dr. Johnson's impressive credentials, including her Ph.D. in molecular genetics and 16 years of forensic experience, Prosecutor Wilson led her through a carefully structured examination designed to make complex scientific concepts accessible to the jury. In layman's terms, Dr. Johnson explained, indicating microscope images displayed on the courtroom screens, the samples collected from beneath Brandy Isaacs' fingernails contained 3 distinct biological components: skin cells consistent with epithelial tissue that would be scraped from someone's skin during a defensive action, blood cells that did not match the victim's blood type, and microscopic tissue, fragments consistent with the underlying dermis or deeper skin layer. The critical moment in Dr. Johnson's testimony came when she explained the statistical analysis of the DNA profile extracted from these samples. The DNA profile from the skin cells and blood recovered from beneath Mrs. Isaacs' fingernails was compared against the reference sample provided by the defendant. Dr. Johnson paused, ensuring all jurors were following her explanation. The profile is a complete match on all 23 chromosome pairs, with a random match probability of less than 1 in 1.2 billion. She then explained the significance of this number. To put this in perspective, the current world population is approximately 8 billion people. This means the probability that this DNA belongs to someone other than the defendant is significantly less likely than randomly selecting a specific individual from the entire global population. Defense attorney Harrington's cross-examination attempted to introduce doubt by focusing on the possibility of secondary transfer, the concept that DNA could be transferred from one person to another through intermediate contact. Dr. Johnson, isn't it possible that Father Donovan's DNA could have been transferred to Mrs. Isaacs through casual contact at church functions, perhaps a handshake or blessing, and then transferred to her fingernails through normal daily activities? Dr. Johnson's response effectively closed this line of questioning. Secondary transfer typically results in minimal DNA quantities that would not produce the complete profile we obtained. More importantly, the presence of blood matching the defendant's type, combined with the depth at which the cells were embedded under the fingernails, is inconsistent with casual contact and strongly indicates direct, forceful scratching sufficient to break the skin, exactly what we would expect during a life-or-death struggle. The financial evidence that established motive was presented through the complementary testimonies of FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh and forensic accountant Martin Goldstein, whose appearances spanned days 7 and 8 of the trial. Agent Walsh walked the jury through the complex money trail that Robert Isaacs had begun to uncover, using simplified flow charts to illustrate how donations intended for church purposes had been systematically diverted through a series of transfers designed to obscure their ultimate destination. The embezzlement scheme was sophisticated but followed a consistent pattern, Walsh explained, highlighting transactions on the displayed documents. Approximately 15% of donations, particularly large cash donations, and those designated for building funds or mission work, were diverted to intermediate accounts before ultimately reaching offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Martin Goldstein, a forensic accountant with 30 years of experience investigating financial crimes, provided the crucial connection between these diverted funds and Father Donovan himself. The offshore accounts were established using aliases, but the signature cards from these accounts, obtained through international banking cooperation agreements, contain handwriting that our analysis has confirmed matches the defendant's with 97% certainty. Goldstein then detailed the expenditures from these accounts. Over the 8-year period, approximately $2.3 million was diverted from church funds. Of this amount, roughly $800,000 was spent on luxury travel, $350,000 on high-end watches and other personal items, $450,000 on real estate purchased through shell companies, and the remainder invested in various securities and kept as liquid assets in the offshore accounts. The defense's cross-examination of the financial experts focused on the complexity of church accounting systems and the possibility that Robert Isaacs, as a CPA with access to financial records, might have been involved in the embezzlement himself and subsequently eliminated by unknown associates. Harrington pressed Agent Walsh. "Isn't it true that Mr. Isaacs had access to all the same accounts and systems that you claim Father Donovan used to divert these funds?" Walsh's response was measured, but devastating to this theory. Mr. Isaacs had review access as part of his volunteer position on the Financial Committee, but the transaction authorizations all required Father Donovan's approval codes or physical signatures. More importantly, our investigation revealed that Mr. Isaacs maintained modest personal finances consistent with his legitimate income, while Father Donovan, despite a modest official salary of approximately $42,000 annually, was found to have assets exceeding $4 million that correlate directly with the diverted church funds. Perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Eleanor Vasquez, the longtime church secretary who had worked closely with both Father Donovan and the Isaacs family over many years. Taking the stand on day 9 of the trial, Vasquez appeared visibly uncomfortable, her eyes avoiding direct contact with Donovan as she was sworn in. Under gentle questioning from Assistant Prosecutor Sarah Okoye, Vasquez described the events of October 13th, the day before the murders. Robert came to the church office around 4 p.m. looking very serious. He asked to use the photocopier for some financial documents he had prepared. Vasquez's voice trembled slightly as she continued, "While he was making copies, Father Michael came in unexpectedly. He saw what Robert was working on and asked about it. Robert just said it was preparation for Monday's meeting and quickly gathered his papers." Okoye then displayed an email on the courtroom screen, asking Vasquez to identify it. "This is an email Robert sent that afternoon to Bishop Morales and the Diocesan Financial Board, requesting an emergency meeting on Monday, October 16th. The critical detail came next, as Vasquez explained, "Our email system automatically sends blind copies to Father Michael for all outgoing church-related communications. It was set up that way years ago for administrative purposes. So Father Michael would have received this email even though he wasn't directly addressed on it." This testimony established that Donovan had become aware of both Robert's discovery and the imminent meeting where it would be revealed, providing the immediate trigger for the murders. Vasquez also provided damning character evidence when she described changes in Donovan's behavior in the weeks before the murders. He became very concerned about who had access to the donation records, especially after Sophia began helping organize them as part of her volunteer service. Fighting back tears, Vasquez recounted, "3 days before the murders, I overheard him arguing with Robert in his office. I couldn't hear everything, but Robert said something about responsibility to the congregation, and Father Michael responded, 'Some things are more complicated than they appear.' When they came out, they both acted like nothing had happened, but there was such tension between them." The defense's cross-examination of Vasquez attempted to portray her as biased against Donovan due to personal grievances, suggesting she had been passed over for a paid position at the church in favor of another candidate Donovan preferred. This approach backfired when Vasquez responded, "That's true, I was disappointed about not getting that position, but I continued to respect Father Michael as my priest. I trusted him with my confessions, my spiritual guidance, my children's religious education. That's what makes this so painful. I'm not testifying against him out of spite. I'm here because of what I saw and heard, and because 4 people I cared about are dead." The prosecution's final key witness was Detective Logan Brooks, who provided a comprehensive overview of the investigation that tied together the various expert testimonies into a coherent narrative. Taking the stand on day 12 of the trial, Brooks methodically walked through the evidence collection process, the timeline established through witness statements and forensic analysis, and the multiple intersecting threads that all pointed to Donovan as the perpetrator. Using a digital timeline displayed on the courtroom screens, Brooks showed how the financial evidence, DNA match, witness observations, and digital evidence from Donovan's devices created a consistent picture of motive, means, opportunity, and premeditation. The most powerful moment in Brooks's testimony came when Prosecutor Wilson displayed the hunting knife purchased by Donovan 2 days before the murders, recovered from a dumpster 3 miles from the church and matched through microscopic comparison to the wounds on all 4 victims. This knife, Brooks stated, indicating the evidence now sealed in a clear container, contains blood from all 4 victims in microscopic amounts that survived. The defendant's attempt to clean it, the blade width, length, and distinctive serration pattern on one edge perfectly matched the wound characteristics documented by Dr. Chen during the autopsies. Brooks then explained how investigators had connected this knife to Donovan through both the purchase receipt found in his vehicle and surveillance footage from the hardware store showing him buying it while attempting to conceal his identity. Harrington's cross-examination of Detective Brooks focused on potential investigative tunnel vision, suggesting that once Donovan became a suspect, alternative possibilities were not thoroughly explored. Detective, once you discovered Mr. Isaacs was conducting a financial audit, did you investigate whether anyone else associated with the church might have had financial motives to silence him? Brooks's response was measured but firm. We investigated multiple potential suspects, including church staff with financial responsibilities and members of the financial committee. None had the combination of motive, opportunity, means, and physical evidence connecting them to the scene that we found with Father Donovan. Most importantly, none of them left their DNA under Brandy Isaacs' fingernails or had blood from all 4 victims on a knife they had purchased 2 days before the murders. The defense case, beginning on day 14, focused primarily on character witnesses and expert testimony challenging aspects of the prosecution's evidence. Several parishioners testified about Donovan's years of apparent dedication to the community, describing his hospital visits to the sick, counseling during personal crises, and spiritual guidance during difficult times. This testimony, while emotionally compelling, was effectively countered during cross-examination when Wilson had each character witness confirm they had no knowledge of or involvement with church finances, creating a clear separation between Donovan's public persona and his private financial activities. The defense's primary expert witness, Dr. Elaine Harper, a forensic scientist specializing in DNA transfer mechanisms, attempted to introduce doubt about the fingernail evidence by describing studies where DNA had been transferred through intermediary contacts. However, during cross-examination, Wilson had Dr. Harper acknowledge that such studies typically involve trace amounts of DNA rather than the substantial samples recovered in this case, and none involved transferred blood components that would require actual bleeding by the original source. By the time Dr. Harper left the stand, her testimony had arguably strengthened rather than weakened the prosecution's case by highlighting the extraordinary nature of the DNA evidence against Donovan. Father Michael Donovan himself never took the stand in his own defense, a decision that sparked considerable speculation but aligned with his constitutional right against self-incrimination. As the evidence phase of the trial concluded on day 17, both legal teams prepared for closing arguments with the prosecution confident in the comprehensive case they had presented and the defense seeking to leverage any remaining doubts about the scientific evidence or potential alternative suspects. The fate of the man who had betrayed his congregation's trust, first through years of financial theft and ultimately through violence, would soon rest in the hands of 12 jurors tasked with determining whether justice would be served for a family whose only crime was discovering the truth. The courthouse plaza teemed with media personnel, concerned citizens, and curious onlookers on February 3, 2024, as closing arguments concluded, and the jury in the trial of Father Michael Donovan began their deliberations. Security personnel maintained a careful perimeter around the building, separating opposing groups that had formed during the trial, a small but vocal contingent of Donovan's supporters, primarily older parishioners who struggled to reconcile the evidence with the spiritual leader they had trusted, and a larger group of community members expressing solidarity with the Isaacs family and the prosecution. Satellite trucks from national networks lined the adjacent streets, their transmission equipment extending skyward like mechanical sentinels, while reporters delivered live updates against the backdrop of the imposing courthouse, their voices conveying the gravity of a case that had captured attention far beyond Arizona's borders. Inside the deliberation room, 12 jurors began the meticulous process of reviewing 3 weeks of testimony and over 200 pieces of evidence, following Judge Martinez's detailed instructions regarding the legal standards for each charge. Diana Reynolds, a 58-year-old high school principal elected as foreperson by her fellow jurors, established a systematic approach to their discussions, beginning with a review of the physical evidence that formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. "We need to be methodical and thorough," she told the group as they arranged the evidence binders on the large central table. "This isn't about feelings or impressions. It's about whether the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." The deliberations that followed would remain confidential until after the verdict, when several jurors would provide insights into their process during approved post-trial interviews. Courthouse employees, police officers, and regular citizens who had followed the case maintained a strange vigil throughout the first day of deliberations, many expecting a quick verdict given the seemingly overwhelming evidence. When no decision came by the end of the court day at 5 p.m., speculation intensified about potential divisions within the jury or specific evidence points, causing extended discussion. John Mercer, Robert Isaacs' colleague, who had discovered the bodies, spoke briefly to reporters as he left the courthouse. "However long it takes, we just want justice for Robert, Brandy, Sophia, and Thomas. They deserve nothing less than the most careful consideration of every piece of evidence." His words captured the sentiment of many who had known the family, acknowledging that the gravity of 4 lost lives warranted whatever time the jury needed to reach their conclusion. The unexpected length of deliberations provided a final news cycle of analysis and speculation, with legal experts appearing on local and national broadcasts to offer opinions on what might be happening behind closed doors. Former prosecutor Marlene Davis told a Phoenix news station, "In my experience, when you have a case with this much physical evidence, longer deliberations often indicate the jury is being extremely thorough, particularly regarding the legal standard of premeditation that separates first-degree murder from lesser charges." Defense attorney Carlos Ramirez offered a counterpoint on a national broadcast. Extended deliberations could suggest at least some jurors have questions about certain aspects of the evidence, possibly the financial motive or the timeline constructed by the prosecution. These competing interpretations reflected the broader community's divided reactions to the case and intensified the atmosphere of anticipation surrounding the courthouse. At 2:47 p.m. on the second day of deliberations, word spread rapidly through the courthouse that the jury had reached a verdict, triggering a flurry of activity as court personnel prepared for the announcement, and the courtroom filled to capacity within minutes. Judge Martinez had ordered additional security measures for the verdict reading, with uniformed officers positioned throughout the courtroom and the hallway outside, reflecting concerns about potential emotional outbursts given the case's impact on the community. The victims' family members entered first, Brandy's parents, Gerald and Marion Cooper, supporting each other physically and emotionally as they took their places in the front row, accompanied by Robert's brother Michael Isaacs, who had flown in from Chicago for the verdict. They sat with rigid posture, their faces reflecting the strain of months of grief, compounded by the grueling trial process. Father Michael Donovan entered through the side door at precisely 3:15 p.m., his appearance noticeably changed since the trial began. The initial shock of arrest had given way to the physical reality of incarceration, with his frame thinner and his complexion paler from months without sun. He wore the same charcoal gray suit as during opening arguments, now hanging loosely on his diminished physique, and maintained the careful, neutral expression his attorneys had advised throughout the proceedings. Defense attorney James Harrington leaned close to whisper final instructions as they took their seats, while across the aisle, prosecutor Sophia Wilson sat with perfect posture, her expression revealing nothing of her inner thoughts as she exchanged brief glances with her team. At 3:17 p.m., Judge Elena Martinez entered the courtroom, her black robes flowing, as she took her place at the bench with the practiced efficiency that had characterized her management of the entire trial. "The court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice carrying through the hushed space as everyone rose and then returned to their seats at the judge's direction. "I understand the jury has reached a verdict," Judge Martinez stated, looking toward the jury box where 12 citizens prepared to fulfill the most solemn responsibility of their civic duty. "Before the verdict is read, I remind everyone present that this is a court of law. Regardless of the outcome, I expect and require complete decorum from all present." Her gaze swept the gallery, lingering briefly on the areas where emotional responses seemed most likely, before she nodded to the bailiff. "Please bring in the jury." The jurors filed in silently, their expressions carefully neutral as they avoided eye contact with both the defendant and the victim's family members, taking their places in the jury box with the deliberate movements of people acutely aware of their role in a momentous process. Foreperson Diana Reynolds handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Martinez. The judge reviewed the document for several seconds, her expression revealing nothing before she returned it to the bailiff to be handed to the court clerk for the official reading. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Martinez instructed, and Father Michael Donovan stood slowly, flanked by his attorneys, his hands clasped before him, in a gesture reminiscent of prayer, but which some observers later suggested appeared more like a reflexive attempt to control trembling. The clerk began reading in a clear, steady voice. "In the matter of State of Arizona versus Michael Andrew Donovan, case number CR 2023-78542, on the count of murder in the first degree of Robert Isaacs, we, the jury, find the defendant." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath during the slight pause that followed. "Guilty." A subtle wave of reaction rippled through the gallery, not sound, but movement, the physical manifestation of emotional response tightly controlled in accordance with the judge's instructions. The clerk continued through each count methodically. "On the count of murder in the first degree of Brandy Isaacs, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Sophia Isaacs, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree of Thomas Isaacs, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." As the financial crimes were enumerated, grand theft, embezzlement, money laundering, tax evasion, each followed by the word guilty, Donovan's carefully maintained composure began to fracture. His shoulders slumped incrementally with each pronouncement, the cumulative weight of the verdict physically manifesting as the full measure of his crimes was officially acknowledged. By the time the clerk finished reading the unanimous guilty verdicts on all counts, Donovan stood with his head slightly bowed, his attorney's hand on his arm, in what appeared to be both support and restraint. Judge Martinez thanked the jury for their service before addressing procedural matters. "Sentencing will be scheduled for February 24, 2024. The defendant will remain in custody until that time." With a single rap of her gavel, she concluded the proceedings, and court officers moved forward to escort Donovan from the courtroom. The emotional restraint that had characterized the verdict reading gave way to powerful reactions once participants left the courtroom. In the hallway outside, Brandy's mother, Marion Cooper, collapsed into her husband's arms, releasing long, suppressed sobs that echoed through the marble corridor. "It doesn't bring them back," Gerald Cooper told reporters through his own tears, "but it means something that the truth has been recognized. Robert, Brandy, Sophia, and Thomas deserved nothing less." Robert's brother Michael stood beside them, his expression simultaneously relieved and hollow, as he added, "Justice has been served legally, but there's no sentence that can possibly address what was taken from us. 4 beautiful lives ended because of greed and betrayal by someone they trusted completely." Prosecutor Sophia Wilson held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, her professional demeanor softened by evident emotional exhaustion after the intense 3-week trial. Today's verdict represents the culmination of extraordinary work by the Phoenix Police Department, forensic experts, and the dedicated professionals of the District Attorney's Office, she stated, acknowledging the team standing behind her. But more importantly, it represents justice for 4 innocent people whose lives were cut short by the defendant's actions. When asked about the expected sentence, Wilson was circumspect. "That decision rests with Judge Martinez, but given the particularly heinous nature of these crimes, we will be recommending the maximum possible sentence under Arizona law." Defense attorney James Harrington made a brief statement outside his office later that afternoon, his tone measured as he addressed the assembled media. "While we respect the jury's verdict, we maintain that there were significant issues with some of the evidence presented by the prosecution. We will be exploring all available avenues for appeal." When pressed for specifics, Harrington declined to elaborate, stating only that the legal process continues beyond today's verdict, before ending the impromptu press conference and returning to his office, where sources indicated the defense team immediately began preparing post-trial motions challenging specific evidentiary rulings made during the proceedings. The verdict triggered a complex range of reactions throughout Phoenix's religious community, particularly among parishioners of St. Catherine's Church. Father Thomas Rivera, who had been appointed as interim priest following Donovan's arrest, held an evening prayer service attended by over 300 people seeking communal support in processing the confirmation of their former spiritual leader's guilt. Today we confront the reality that even those entrusted with sacred responsibilities can succumb to darkness, Father Rivera told the congregation, many of whom wept openly during his homily. But we must remember that our faith is not in individuals who may fail us, but in eternal truths that transcend human weakness. The service concluded with prayers for the Isaacs family, for healing in the community, and even for Michael Donovan himself, reflecting the Christian principle of compassion, even for those who have committed terrible acts. The small group of Donovan's supporters who had maintained belief in his innocence throughout the trial diminished significantly following the verdict, with several former supporters expressing shock at the unanimous decision across all charges. "I truly believed there must have been some mistake," admitted Elaine Winterset, a 72-year-old parishioner who had attended every day of the trial wearing a button with Donovan's image. But 12 people heard all the evidence and had no doubt. "I have to accept that the man I thought I knew never really existed." Her sentiments echoed those of many who had struggled to reconcile their personal experiences with Donovan as a spiritual guide with his actions, as revealed during the trial, a cognitive dissonance that for many was finally resolved by the jury's unequivocal finding of guilt. Local and national media coverage of the verdict emphasized different aspects of the case, with Phoenix outlets focusing on the community impact, while national reports highlighted the broader themes of religious authority and betrayal of trust. The Arizona Republic's front page the following morning carried the headline, guilty on all counts, justice for the Isaacs family, alongside photographs of the victims in life rather than the defendant, a deliberate editorial choice to center the victims rather than their killer. National broadcasts featured panels of legal and religious experts discussing the case's implications for trust in religious institutions, with several commentators noting the particularly devastating impact when spiritual leaders violate the profound trust placed in them by their communities. Post-trial interviews with jurors, approved by Judge Martinez but limited to general process rather than specific deliberations, revealed the careful, methodical approach the 12 citizens had taken to their responsibility. We created a detailed chart of all the evidence for each charge, foreperson Diana Reynolds explained to the Arizona Republic. We wanted to be absolutely certain that every element required by law was proven beyond reasonable doubt. Another juror, Michael Denton, addressed the length of deliberations. We weren't in there debating whether he was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. We were making sure we thoroughly examined everything, especially the financial evidence that established motive. We owed that level of care to the victims and to the process itself. The verdict provided a measure of closure for the extended community affected by the murders. From colleagues at Robert's accounting firm and Brandy's fellow teachers to Sophia's debate team members and Thomas's baseball teammates, all of whom had struggled with the senseless loss. Desert Willow Elementary School, where Brandy had taught 4th grade, announced plans for a memorial garden to be created in the Isaacs family's honor, with Principal Janice Wong explaining, "We want current and future students to know about Brandy's dedication to education and her family's legacy of integrity, even though the circumstances of their loss are too difficult for younger children to fully comprehend." Similarly, Phoenix Central High School established a scholarship in Sophia's name for students demonstrating excellence in journalism and debate. The fields where she had shown such promise before her life was cut short. As night fell on the day of the verdict, the Arcadia neighborhood where the Isaacs had lived held an impromptu vigil, with hundreds of community members walking silently past the family's home, now sold by the estate, but maintained as a place of remembrance by its new owners who had agreed to preserve the front garden planted by Brandy and Sophia. Neighbors placed candles along the sidewalk, creating a path of light that stretched for blocks, a visual representation of the lives that had touched so many before being extinguished by an act of ultimate betrayal. Standing among the mourners, Detective Logan Brooks observed the proceedings with professional detachment, masking personal investment, his responsibility to seek justice fulfilled, but the weight of 4 lost lives still evident in his measured movements and watchful gaze as the community began its long journey toward healing from wounds that would leave permanent scars on the collective consciousness of Phoenix. February 24, 2024. Dawned clear and unusually cool for Phoenix, the desert air crisp, as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the courthouse where Michael Donovan would face sentencing for the murders of the Isaacs family and his years of financial crimes against St. Catherine's Church. The morning's tranquility contrasted sharply with the atmosphere inside the building, where heightened security measures reflected the case's continued emotional impact on the community and concerns about potential disruptions during the final legal chapter of a tragedy that had shattered so many lives. Court officers conducted thorough security screenings of all attendees, and Judge Elena Martinez had ordered limited seating in the gallery, prioritizing family members of the victims while allocating remaining spaces through a controlled lottery system that had drawn hundreds of applicants for the few available seats. The sentencing hearing began precisely at 9 a.m., Judge Martinez maintaining the punctuality and procedural rigor that had characterized the entire trial. Michael Donovan, now officially convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and multiple financial crimes, appeared markedly changed from the confident priest who had once delivered sermons to hundreds of trusting parishioners. 20 pounds lighter than at the start of the trial, with his prison-issued glasses replacing the designer frames he had worn previously, Donovan entered the courtroom in shackles, his prison jumpsuit replaced for the hearing with a simple gray suit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. Gone was any vestige of the charismatic spiritual leader. In his place stood a man whose crimes had stripped away not just his freedom, but the carefully constructed identity he had maintained for years. The victim impact statements began the proceedings, offering family members and close friends their first opportunity to address both the court and the convicted murderer directly. Brandy's father, Gerald Cooper, approached the podium with the deliberate movements of a man carrying an unbearable burden, his voice initially unsteady but gaining strength as he spoke. 21 years ago, I walked my daughter Brandy down the aisle at St. Catherine's Church, where the defendant performed the ceremony that joined her to Robert. I entrusted my child's spiritual guidance to him. Cooper paused, his gaze shifting directly to Donovan, who kept his eyes fixed on the table before him. Now, I've had to bury that daughter, her husband, and my 2 grandchildren because of that same man's greed and callousness. There is no punishment severe enough to balance this equation, but I ask the court to ensure he never again has the opportunity to destroy another family. Marion Cooper followed her husband, clutching a framed family photograph taken at Thomas's 13th birthday celebration just 2 months before the murders. "This is what the defendant took from us," she stated, turning the photograph toward Donovan, who continued to avoid eye contact. Not just 4 lives, but all the future moments that should have been graduations, weddings, grandchildren, holidays, ordinary Tuesday dinners. Every day I wake up to the same realization that my daughter and her children are gone, and every night I go to sleep with the knowledge that their last moments were filled with terror and pain. Her voice broke as she concluded. The defendant presented himself as a messenger of God while acting as an agent of unimaginable evil. I pray he spends the rest of his life contemplating what he has done, though I have no hope he is capable of true remorse. Robert's brother, Michael Isaacs, provided perhaps the most damning victim impact statement, his calm, measured tone contrasting with the raw emotion of his words. My brother discovered the truth because he believed in accountability and transparency. He was preparing to address the financial crimes in a way that would have protected the church community from public scandal while ensuring the stolen funds were recovered. Isaacs's professional background as an attorney was evident in his precise language as he continued. Instead of accepting responsibility when his crimes were discovered, the defendant chose to commit 4 murders to silence the truth. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated decision that the lives of an entire family were worth less than his freedom and access to stolen money. There is only one appropriate response to this level of premeditated cruelty: that the defendant never again experience life outside prison walls. Sophia's debate coach, Elizabeth Chen, spoke on behalf of the teenager's friends and school community, describing a young woman of extraordinary intelligence, compassion, and integrity, whose potential had been erased by an act of ultimate betrayal. Sophia trusted Father Donovan as her spiritual guide since childhood. She served at the altar alongside him, believed in the values he preached while violating them himself, and ultimately died because she and her family represented a threat to his secret life of theft and deception. Chen's professional composure momentarily faltered as she added, "Her debate teammates still expect to see her walk into the room with her color-coded research notes and encouraging smile. We've had to learn that evil can wear a collar of trust, and that justice, while necessary, cannot restore what was taken from us." Thomas's baseball coach, James Morales, represented the youngest victim, describing a 13-year-old boy with boundless energy, genuine kindness, and the rare ability to make everyone around him feel included and valued. Morales spoke of how Thomas's team had retired his jersey number and dedicated their season to his memory, but struggled with the incomprehensible nature of his loss. These kids have had to confront the reality that someone they were taught to trust completely, their priest, committed an act of violence beyond their understanding. Thomas deserved to grow up, to develop his talents, to experience life's joys and challenges. Instead, his potential was sacrificed to protect a secret that was never worth a single human life, let alone four. Following the victim impact statements, Prosecutor Sophia Wilson addressed the court regarding sentencing recommendations. Your Honor, the state of Arizona requests the maximum possible sentence for each charge to be served consecutively rather than concurrently, reflecting both the heinous nature of these crimes and the defendant's complete lack of remorse throughout these proceedings. Wilson methodically outlined the aggravating factors justifying maximum sentences: the multiple victims, including minor children, the extensive premeditation evidenced by the defendant's preparations, the breach of trust inherent in his position as the victim's priest, and the financial motivation behind the murders. The defendant's actions represent the most profound violation of both human and divine law, using a position of spiritual authority to commit theft, and then committing murder to conceal that theft. Justice demands he never again have the opportunity to harm others. Defense attorney James Harrington offered a brief statement focused primarily on procedural matters and potential grounds for appeal rather than substantive arguments for leniency, acknowledging the strategic reality that, given the jury's verdict and the nature of the crimes, mitigation was unlikely to significantly impact sentencing. While respecting the jury's decision, we maintain that certain evidentiary rulings during trial raise substantial legal questions that will be addressed through appropriate appellate procedures. Harrington's statement appeared designed primarily to establish groundwork for future appeals, while avoiding any arguments that might further inflame sentiment against his client, whose chances for anything less than the maximum sentence were effectively non-existent, given the circumstances. When asked if he wished to make a statement before sentencing, Michael Donovan broke his courtroom silence for the first time since the trial began. Rising slowly, he adjusted his glasses before speaking in a voice that retained echoes of his practiced pulpit cadence, but was notably subdued. I understand nothing I can say will be adequate to address the pain experienced by the Isaacs family and this community. I can only express deep regret for the circumstances that have brought us all to this moment. His carefully worded statement, conspicuously avoiding direct admission of guilt while expressing generalized regret, drew audible reactions of disgust from several people in the gallery, prompting Judge Martinez to rap her gavel once in warning. Donovan concluded with what many later described as the most revealing statement of his true character. I pray that all involved will eventually find peace, placing himself rhetorically among the victims of circumstance rather than acknowledging his role as the perpetrator of calculated violence. Judge Elena Martinez delivered her sentencing decision with the measured authority that had characterized her management of the entire case, her expression grave, as she addressed the convicted murderer directly. Mr. Donovan, the jury has found you guilty of crimes that represent the most profound betrayal of trust imaginable. As a priest, you were entrusted not just with material resources, but with the spiritual welfare of an entire community. You abused that trust first through years of systematic theft, and ultimately through violence when your crimes were discovered. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as she continued. You made a deliberate choice that your freedom and continued access to stolen funds were worth more than the lives of 4 innocent people, including 2 children. This court cannot comprehend the moral emptiness required to make such a calculation. Judge Martinez then delivered the sentence that would make headlines across the country. For the murder of Robert Isaacs, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the murder of Brandy Isaacs, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the murder of Sophia Isaacs, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the murder of Thomas Isaacs, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She continued through the financial crimes, adding 35 years in additional consecutive sentences before delivering the statement that would be quoted in every news report. Mr. Donovan, you presented yourself as a priest while violating every principle of the faith you claim to represent. You're no priest. You're a thief who became a murderer to hide your crimes. You will serve the remainder of your natural life in prison, and this court hopes that every day of that life is burdened by the full weight of what you have done. With the rap of the gavel, the formal legal proceedings against Michael Donovan concluded, but the case's impact on the Phoenix community and beyond was only beginning to unfold. Immediate media coverage focused on the 175-year total sentence, effectively 4 consecutive life terms plus additional time for the financial crimes, ensuring Donovan would never experience freedom again. National broadcasts featured the judge's "You're no priest" statement prominently, the phrase quickly becoming shorthand for the case itself in public discourse. Legal analysts generally praise the sentence as appropriate given the circumstances, with former prosecutor Vanessa Rodriguez telling a national news program, "This sentence reflects not just the number of victims, but the extraordinary breach of trust involved when someone uses a position of spiritual authority to both steal from and ultimately murder those who trusted him." The Catholic Diocese of Phoenix, which had maintained a careful distance from Donovan following his arrest while providing pastoral support to St. Catherine's parishioners, issued a formal statement following sentencing. Bishop Anthony Morales addressed both the specific case and broader concerns about trust in religious institutions. Today's sentence cannot restore what was lost, but it does represent temporal justice for crimes that violated both human and divine law. The Diocese of Phoenix reaffirms our commitment to transparency, accountability, and the protection of all who place their trust in the Church. The statement also detailed reforms implemented since the crimes were discovered, including independent financial oversight of all parish accounts, mandatory audit procedures, and expanded background checks for clergy and staff. St. Catherine's Church itself became a focal point for community healing in the months following the sentencing. Father Thomas Rivera, whose interim appointment had been made permanent, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust within a congregation deeply traumatized by betrayal. The Church established the Isaacs Family Memorial Foundation, using donations to create scholarship funds for students pursuing careers in accounting, education, journalism, and youth sports, fields that reflected each victim's interests and contributions. The foundation also funded expanded financial oversight systems for parishes throughout Arizona, transforming tragedy into concrete reforms designed to prevent similar abuses of trust in the future. The Isaacs family home, which had remained unoccupied since the murders, became the subject of community discussion regarding its appropriate disposition. After consultation with extended family members, the property was purchased by a nonprofit organization and converted into a community resource center named Isaac's Legacy, offering financial literacy education, counseling services, and youth mentoring programs. The center's director, former colleague of Robert's Jason Mercer, explained the transformation. "We wanted to reclaim this space from tragedy and continue the Isaacs family's commitment to education, integrity, and community service. Rather than allowing these 4 walls to remain defined by loss, we've created a place where their values continue to improve lives." Detective Logan Brooks, whose methodical investigation had built the case against Donovan, received commendations from both the Phoenix Police Department and the FBI for his work. In a rare interview 6 months after the sentencing, Brooks reflected on the case's impact on his own perspective. In 20 years of homicide investigation, I've never encountered a more profound betrayal of trust. This case fundamentally changed how I view the intersection of authority and accountability. Brooks subsequently became an advocate for improved financial oversight systems in nonprofit organizations, occasionally speaking at law enforcement conferences about the investigative techniques that uncovered Donovan's dual life of theft and ultimate violence. The financial investigation continued long after Donovan's sentencing, with FBI agents and international banking authorities working to recover the embezzled funds. Approximately $1.8 million was eventually reclaimed from offshore accounts and investments, though nearly $700,000 remained unaccounted for, presumably spent by Donovan on his secret luxury lifestyle over the years. The recovered funds were returned to St. Catherine's Church with legal stipulations requiring their use for the specific purposes originally intended by donors, building maintenance, community outreach, and educational programs, with independent oversight ensuring proper allocation and transparency. Broader discussions about trust in religious institutions emerged as a lasting legacy of the case, with increased scrutiny of financial practices in churches nationwide. Several religious organizations implemented enhanced transparency measures in direct response to the Donovan case, recognizing that financial accountability was essential to maintaining congregational trust. Seminary education programs added or expanded curriculum addressing financial ethics and proper oversight procedures, acknowledging that spiritual leaders required specific training to appropriately manage the material resources entrusted to their care, while maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and institutional finances. For the extended families of the victims, the sentencing provided legal closure, but only the beginning of a lifelong journey through grief and adjustment to profound loss. Gerald and Marion Cooper established a support group for grandparents who had lost both children and grandchildren to violence, creating a space where others experiencing this particular form of compounded grief could find understanding and practical assistance. There's no roadmap for this kind of loss, Marion explained at the group's first meeting. We're learning to navigate it together, honoring our loved ones by continuing to live with purpose even when that seems impossible. Their efforts expanded into a national network providing resources and advocacy for families affected by multiple victim homicides. 3 years after the sentencing, on the anniversary of the murders, a memorial service at St. Catherine's Church brought together hundreds of community members whose lives had been touched by the Isaacs family. The service, led by Father Rivera with participation from clergy of multiple faiths, emphasized themes of resilience, community healing, and the enduring impact of lives well lived despite their premature ending. Robert, Brandy, Sophia, and Thomas Isaacs are not defined by how they died, but by how they lived, Father Rivera told the congregation. Their legacy continues in this community's commitment to truth, transparency, and care for one another, values they exemplified and which stand in stark contrast to the darkness that took them from us. Michael Donovan himself largely disappeared from public consciousness following his transfer to the Arizona State Prison Complex, where he was placed in protective custody due to his former religious position and the high-profile nature of his crimes. Occasional legal filings by his attorneys generated brief media attention, though all appeals were ultimately rejected as the evidence against him withstood scrutiny at every level of review. Prison officials reported that Donovan maintained a solitary existence, rarely participating in available programs and declining most visitors except his legal representatives. A prison chaplain who had attempted to provide spiritual counsel reported that Donovan seems to exist in a state of emotional detachment, neither acknowledging responsibility for his actions nor expressing genuine remorse. The most profound and lasting legacy of the case emerged in the lives touched by the Isaacs family during their time on Earth. Students taught by Brandy, who carried her lessons of kindness into adulthood, colleagues influenced by Robert's unwavering integrity, young debaters inspired by Sophia's passion for truth, and teammates who remembered Thomas's unfailing sportsmanship. At Desert Willow Elementary School, the memorial garden created in Brandy's honor became a living classroom where new generations of students learned about nature, responsibility, and the teacher who had believed education extended far beyond textbooks. The annual Sophia Isaacs Memorial Debate Tournament at Phoenix Central High School grew to include schools from across Arizona, participants competing for scholarships while embodying the principles of respectful discourse and evidence-based argument that Sophia had exemplified. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph came not from court documents or media coverage, but from a simple plaque installed at the Community Resource Center that had once been the family's home. Beneath photographs of Robert, Brandy, Sophia, and Thomas Isaacs, the inscription read, "Truth is not diminished by darkness, but rather shines more brightly against it." The Isaacs family sought truth, lived with integrity, and left a legacy that continues in every life they touched. Though taken by an act of ultimate betrayal, they are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived, with purpose, compassion, and unwavering commitment to what is right. May we honor their memory by doing the same. This sentiment, reflecting both the tragedy of their loss and the triumph of their lasting influence, encapsulated a community's determination that justice, healing, and positive legacy would be the final chapter in a story that began with betrayal but would not be defined by it.